You stand at the doorway of the cooperage and you watch the last boat of the season slip out of the harbour mouth. The vessel is a small two-masted fishing schooner with patched tan sails and a hull made dark by the wet autumn weather. It moves very slowly against the grey water, and the sound of the hull pushing through the light chop is already fading into the distance before the ship has even cleared the headland. There is no waving from the deck, and no shouting from the shore, because the men who left on that boat are all that is left of the summer population, and they are tired from months of hauling cod, and they are only thinking about the long sail south to the warmer harbours of Devon or Bristol. You watch the shape of the sails grow smaller and smaller until they are just a pale smudge against the dark rock of the point, and then the smudge is gone, and the water in the cove becomes a single flat sheet of pewter grey, with no mark of human presence upon it. The door of the cooperage is made of heavy spruce planks, and it drags across the dirt floor when you push it closed. You lift the wooden latch and let it fall into its iron catch with a soft clunk that sounds very loud in the new silence. The cooperage is a low building set back from the water's edge behind a row of fish flakes that are now empty of their summer burden. The flakes are wooden stages built on tall poles, where the split cod were laid out to dry in the salt wind all through July and August and September. Now the poles are bare, and the wind passes through them with a hollow rushing noise that rises and falls but never stops. The walls of the cooperage are made from spruce logs cut on the hillside above the outport 2 autumns ago, and they still weep small beads of golden resin in the warmth of the hearth, even though the outside air is cold enough to freeze a bucket of water solid in under an hour. The chinking between the logs is a mixture of dried moss and clay and a little bit of rendered animal fat to keep the draughts from finding their way inside, and it smells faintly of the forest floor and of old smoke and of something that reminds you of the way a wool blanket smells after it has hung by the fire for a very long time. The first thing you notice when you turn back into the room is the inventory of your winter. There are stacks of rough staves leaning against the north wall in bundles of 12 tied with strips of worn sailcloth. These staves were cut from black spruce trees that grew slowly on the rocky slopes, where the soil is thin and the wind bends everything toward the east. Because the trees grew so slowly, the growth rings are packed tight together and the wood is dense and heavy with resin, and it makes a clear ringing sound when you tap it with a knuckle, unlike the dull thud of faster-grown wood from softer climates. The staves are still rough from the splitting froe and the draw-knife work that shaped them in the woods last month before the first hard frost made the ground too slippery for the horses to haul the sledges. You walk over to the stacks, and you run the palm of your bare hand along the edge of the topmost stave, feeling the texture of the grain that runs in long straight lines from one end to the other, with only a few small knots where branches once grew. The wood is cold to the touch, and it holds the cold for a long time after you take your hand away. Along the east wall of the cooperage there is a long bench, made from a single slab of pine that is worn smooth in the middle, where countless staves have been pushed back and forth across its surface. Above the bench, on wooden pegs driven into the log wall, hang the tools of the trade. There is a cooper's adze with a curved blade that is kept bright and free of rust by regular oiling with rendered cod liver oil that leaves a faint slick sheen on the steel. There is a heavy wooden jointer plane that is almost as long as your arm from elbow to fingertip, and its wooden body is polished to a dark honey brown by the friction of many seasons of use. The plane rests on its side so that the iron blade does not dull against the wood of the bench, and there is a thin curl of shaving still caught in the mouth of the plane from the last time it was used. A pale ribbon of spruce that is so thin you can almost see the light of the lantern through it. There is a crow's for cutting the groove that holds the barrel head, a tool that looks like a small saw set into a wooden fence that rides along the inside curve of the staves. There are several sizes of hammers and mallets hanging by their handles, the iron heads dark with age, and the wooden handles smooth and warm-looking. Even in the dim light, there are draw knives and spoke shaves and a heavy froe that is kept near the hearth because the iron of the froe can become brittle in the extreme cold, and you do not want it to snap when you are splitting out the hazel hoops later in the winter. The floor of the cooperage is not made of planks but of packed earth that has been trodden down over the years until it is as hard as fired clay, and it has a slight slope toward the door so that any water from melting snow or from the wetting of the staves will run out instead of pooling under your feet. Scattered across this earthen floor are the leavings of previous workdays. There are wood shavings in curls and spirals, and long thin strips, and they lie in drifts against the legs of the workbench like tiny waves of pale wood. When you walk across the floor, the shavings crunch softly under your leather boots, and the sound is a dry rustling that reminds you of walking through fallen leaves in the autumn woods. Near the hearth there is a small pile of bark and splinters and broken bits of wood that are too small to be used for anything except kindling for the fire. The fire itself is not a roaring blaze, but a small compact bed of coals that glows a steady orange red from within a ring of stones set into the corner of the room. The chimney is made from stones gathered from the beach, and it rises up through the roof in a slightly crooked column that draws the smoke up and out into the grey sky, where it is immediately torn apart by the wind and scattered over the barren hillside behind the outport. You move a little closer to the hearth, and you feel the warmth on your face and on your hands, which have grown stiff from the cold air near the door. The warmth is not strong enough to make the room truly warm, but it pushes back the edge of the chill, and it creates a small pocket of comfort in the immediate area around the stones. You can see your breath as a faint mist in the air when you step back from the hearth, and the mist hangs for a moment before it fades into the general dimness of the room. The lantern that hangs from a beam in the center of the ceiling is the main source of light, now that the door is closed and the small window set high in the west wall is covered with a piece of oiled linen that lets in only a diffuse grey glow. The lantern is a simple tin box with a glass pane on one side and a wick that draws up the oil from a reservoir in the base. The flame is small and steady, and it casts a warm yellow circle of light that reaches about 8 feet in every direction before it fades into shadow. The shadows around the edges of the room are deep and soft, and they shift very slowly as the lantern sways just slightly on its chain in response to the drafts that find their way through the chinking, despite all your efforts to seal them. The sound of the cooperage is a sound that you do not notice until you stop moving and listen for it. There is the low, steady hiss and pop of the fire as the coals shift, and a small pocket of resin in one of the burning sticks flares up briefly and then subsides. There is the creak of the roof timbers as the wind outside presses against the building and then releases and presses again in a slow rhythm that matches the pulse of the sea on the shore. There is the faint sound of your own breathing, and the sound of the wool of your coat sleeve brushing against the wood of the bench when you lean forward. Outside, the wind is a constant presence, but it is not a loud wind today because the storm track is far out to sea, and the only weather is a heavy overcast that presses down on the hills and muffles everything. You can hear the sound of the ice forming in the cove if you listen very carefully, a thin, high pinging sound that is almost like the ring of a very distant bell struck once and then left to fade. This is the sound of the surface water freezing into a skin of new ice that will thicken over the coming weeks until it is strong enough to walk on and then strong enough to support the weight of a sled loaded with firewood from the far side of the harbour. The inventory of your winter is not only the wood and the tools but also the supplies that you have laid in against the long months of isolation. There is a barrel of flour set on a wooden rack to keep it off the cold floor, and a smaller barrel of salt pork and a sack of dried peas that hangs from a rafter to keep the mice from finding it. There is a clay crock of molasses and a small wooden box of hard biscuit, and a string of dried fish that hangs near the door where the cold air will keep it from spoiling. These supplies were brought up from the ship before it sailed, and they are meant to last until the first vessel returns in the spring, which might be as early as May, if the ice goes out early, or as late as June if the winter holds on and the sea remains frozen far out from the shore. You have been through winters here before, and you know that the supply will be enough if you are careful with the portions, and if you do not waste anything. The carefulness is a habit that has become part of you, like the way you always check the edge of a plane iron before you start a new stave, or the way you always hang the hammers with the handles pointing out so you can grab them without looking. You turn back to the stack of rough staves, and you select one from the top of the pile. You lift it with both hands, and you feel the weight of it and the balance of it along its length. This stave is about 3 feet long and 4 inches wide, and 1.5 inches thick at the center, tapering slightly toward both ends. It is rough and splintery in places, and there are small ridges where the draw knife skipped over a knot. But overall the shape is true, and the grain runs straight from end to end, without any major flaws that would cause it to split when the barrel is tightened. You carry the stave over to the bench, and you lay it down with the bark side facing up, and you take a moment to look at it in the light of the lantern. The bark side is the outside of the tree, and it still shows traces of the rough outer bark in patches of dark brown and grey, while the sapwood beneath is a pale cream colour with a faint pinkish tint that comes from the resin content of the spruce. The inside of the stave, which is the side that will face the interior of the barrel, is smoother and lighter in colour, and it has a silky texture that catches the light in a soft glow. You do not begin to work on the stave right away, because this is not the time for working. This is the time for looking and for waiting and for letting the wood adjust to the dry air of the cooperage after spending weeks stacked outside under a loose covering of spruce boughs. The moisture in the wood needs to leave slowly so that the stave does not crack or warp, and this process takes time and patience, and it cannot be hurried. You run your thumb along the edge of the stave, feeling the small imperfections in the rough cut, and you make a mental note of where you will need to take a little more wood off with the draw knife, and where you can leave a little extra thickness to account for the shaping that will happen later. This is a quiet kind of thinking that does not involve words but only shapes and curves and the memory of how a well-made barrel should look and feel when it is finished. The day outside, which was never very bright to begin with, has begun to fade into the early twilight of a November afternoon. The grey light coming through the oiled linen window changes from a flat pewter colour to a deeper shade of blue-grey, and then to a darkness that is almost complete except for the faint glow of the snow that has begun to fall very lightly outside. You can see the snowflakes drifting past the window if you stand close to it and look up through a small tear in the linen, and they are large and soft, and they fall straight down because there is no wind at ground level to push them sideways. The snow settles on the roof of the cooperage with a soft sound that is less than a whisper, and it begins to pile up in the corners of the window frame where the wood meets the oiled cloth. This snow will continue to fall through the night, and by morning there will be a fresh white layer over everything that will muffle the already quiet world even further. You take the lantern down from its hook, and you check the level of the oil in the reservoir, and you trim the wick with a small pair of shears that you keep on the mantel above the hearth. The wick needs to be trimmed so that it burns cleanly without smoking, and you do this with a careful snip that removes the charred black tip and leaves a fresh clean edge of twisted cotton. You replace the lantern on its hook, and you watch the flame settle back into its steady yellow glow. The light falls on the stacks of staves and on the tools hanging on the wall, and on the curved shape of a half-finished barrel that sits in the corner waiting for its final hoops, and it makes the wood look warm and alive even though the room is cold, except for the small circle of warmth near the fire. The last boat south is now many miles away, moving down the coast with the wind at its back, and the men aboard are settling into the routine of the passage. They will not think of this outport again until the spring, when the ice breaks up and the cod begin to run and the cycle of the fishing year begins again. You will be here through all the days between now and then, through the short grey days of December and the long dark nights of January and the bitter cold of February, when the sea smoke rises from the open leads in the ice, and the whole world seems to be made of frost and silence. The barrels that you build this winter will be filled with salt cod in the summer, and they will be loaded onto ships bound for Portugal and Spain and the islands of the Caribbean, where the fish will be traded for wine and salt and sugar, and the cycle will continue as it has for generations. But all of that is far away now, and the only thing that matters is the wood in front of you, and the tools on the wall, and the slow, steady rhythm of the winter days as they pass one after another in the quiet of the cooperage by the frozen sea. You sit down on the low stool by the hearth, and you pull a piece of the rough stave across your knees, and you begin the first slow work of examining the grain and marking the lines where you will cut and shape and smooth in the days to come. The fire pops softly, and a small coal falls onto the stone hearth and blows there for a moment before it fades to grey ash. The wind outside shifts direction slightly, and the creaking of the roof timbers changes pitch by a small degree and then settles back into its familiar pattern. The snow continues to fall without sound, and the cove continues to freeze, and the long winter isolation of 1684 has begun in the Newfoundland the outport, and it will continue for many months before the first sail appears on the horizon, and the world returns to this quiet place by the sea. The morning light comes so slowly that you cannot mark the exact moment when the darkness begins to lift. The window in the west wall remains a square of deep blue-black for a very long time, and then it softens by degrees into a grey that is barely lighter than the shadows in the corners of the room. You have been sitting on the low stool by the hearth for some time before this change happens, and you have watched the coals in the fire shift from bright orange to a dull red and then back to orange as you added small pieces of dry spruce branch one at a time, with long pauses between each addition. The warmth from the hearth spreads outward in a circle that reaches your knees and your hands and the front of your wool coat, but does not touch your back or the nape of your neck, where the cold air from the rest of the cooperage settles like a thin layer of frost that you can feel but not see. The rough stave that you selected the night before still rests across your knees, and you spent the dark hours of the early morning running your fingertips along its surface in the same way that a person might read a page of text written in a language they almost understand. The wood is black spruce from a tree that grew on the north-facing slope, above the outport where the soil is thin and stony, and the growing season is so short that the tree put on only a thin layer of new wood each summer, before the cold returned and stopped all growth for another long winter. Because of this slow growth, the grain of the wood is different from the wood that comes from the great forests of the old country, where the summers are long and warm, and the trees grow fast and put on wide rings of soft pale wood between the darker lines of the winter rest. You have seen barrels made from English oak and French chestnut, and they are beautiful things with broad sweeping grain patterns that catch the light and seem to move when you turn the barrel in your hands. But the spruce of this northern island is a different creature altogether, and it has a different kind of beauty that is quieter and more hidden and requires a certain kind of patience to understand. You lift the stave closer to your face and you tilt it so that the faint grey light from the window falls across the surface at a low angle. The growth rings appear as a series of fine parallel lines that run the length of the stave from end to end, with only small deviations where a knot interrupts the flow. The lines are not evenly spaced the way they would be in a fast-grown tree from a gentler climate, but instead they are crowded together in tight bands of 10 or 12 or 15 rings packed into the space of a single inch. Each ring represents 1 year of the tree's life, and when you look closely at the rings, you can read the story of those years in the way that a sailor reads the weather in the clouds. There are years where the ring is slightly wider, and the wood between the dark lines is a little bit paler and softer. And those were the summers when the fog did not linger so long on the coast, and the sun reached the hillside for a few extra hours each day, and the tree was able to grow just a little more than usual before the frost returned. And there are years where the ring is so thin that it is barely more than a hair's breadth of dark color, and those were the summers when the ice stayed in the coves until late June, and the fog never lifted and the tree struggled just to keep its needles green against the constant damp and cold. You run the flat of your thumb across the grain, and you feel the subtle ridges that the rings create on the surface of the rough-cut wood. The darker lines, which are the winter wood, are denser and harder than the lighter wood of the summer growth, and they stand up just slightly above the surrounding surface like the ribs of a very thin and very patient animal. When you push your thumbnail into the lighter summer wood, it leaves a small crescent-shaped mark that fades after a moment as the wood slowly springs back into shape, because spruce has a certain amount of give to it, and it does not hold an impression the way that a softer wood like pine or cedar would do. When you try the same thing on one of the dark winter rings, your thumbnail slides across the surface without leaving any mark at all, because the winter wood is hard and dense and full of the resin that the tree produced to protect itself against the cold and against the insects that would try to bore into its trunk during the brief warmth of the summer. The sound of the wood is another thing that you notice now, that the cooperage is fully quiet except for the small sounds of the fire and the wind and the distant groan of the ice in the cove. You lift the stave and you hold it by one end, and you tap the other end gently against the packed earth of the floor. The sound that comes back is not a dull thud, but a clear ringing note that hangs in the air for a fraction of a second before it fades into the general hush of the room. This is the sound of good barrel wood, and you have learned over the years to listen for it in the same way that a potter listens for the ring of a well-fired pot or a bell founder listens for the true note of the cooling metal. A stave that is too dry, or that has a hidden crack somewhere inside its fibers, will make a flat, dead sound that tells you immediately that it is not fit for the work ahead. A stave that is too wet, or that has a pocket of rot from a long-healed wound in the tree, will make a muffled thud that is just as clear a warning. But this stave sings a clean, bright note and you nod once to yourself in the dim light, and you set it aside on the bench, and you reach for the next one in the stack. The process of selecting and examining each stave is not a quick thing, and it is not meant to be quick. You have many months ahead of you, and the work of the cooper is a work that cannot be hurried, any more than the growth of the tree itself could be hurried. You take each stave from the pile and you hold it up to the light, and you turn it slowly in your hands, feeling the weight and the balance and the way the grain runs from end to end. Some of the staves have a gentle curve already built into them by the natural growth of the tree, and these are the ones that will be used for the sides of the barrel, where the curve of the bilge requires the wood to bend outward and then inward again in a smooth, continuous sweep. Other staves are straighter, and these will be used for the parts of the barrel where the curve is less pronounced, or for the heads that will cap the ends of the cask once the body is assembled. You sort the staves into piles according to their shape and their grain and the small knots that appear here and there, like the closed eyes of the tree, still watching from within the wood. The knots are a particular concern because a knot in the wrong place can cause a stave to split when the hoops are driven tight, or it can create a weak spot that will leak brine once the barrel is filled with salted fish and stacked in the hold of a ship bound for warmer waters. You examine each knot, carefully turning the stave so that the light catches the small dark circle and the swirling grain that surrounds it like a whirlpool frozen in time. A tight knot that is small and sound and fully embedded in the surrounding wood is not a problem, and in fact it can add a certain character to the finished barrel in the way that a scar adds character to a face that has lived through many seasons. But a loose knot that wiggles when you press on it with the tip of your knife, or a knot that has begun to separate from the surrounding wood with a thin black line of decay, is a flaw that cannot be worked around. These staves are set aside in a separate pile near the door, and they will be used for kindling or for the temporary wooden hoops that do not need to hold water, or for the small wedges that you use to tighten the joints between the staves during assembly. The light outside has shifted again while you have been working, and the grey of the early morning has given way to a slightly brighter grey. That means the sun has risen somewhere above the thick blanket of cloud that covers the sky. You cannot see the sun itself, and you will not see it for many days at this time of year, but its presence is marked by this small change in the quality of the light that filters through the oiled linen of the window. The new light is just bright enough that you can see the individual dust motes that hang in the still air of the cooperage, drifting slowly in the currents created by the warmth of the fire. The dust is made of fine wood particles from the sanding and planing of many seasons, and it has a pale golden color in the light. And it moves so slowly that you can watch a single mote for a long time as it rises and falls and drifts across the room on paths that seem random but are actually governed by the invisible movements of the air. You have selected a dozen good staves now, and they are stacked on the bench in a neat row with the bark side facing up and the ends aligned so that you can see the slight variations in width and thickness that will need to be corrected with the draw knife and the jointer plane. Before you begin that work, you take a moment to look at the ends of the staves, where the growth rings are visible as a series of nested arcs that tell the complete story of the tree's life, from the tiny dark circle of the first year's growth at the center to the final ring just under the bark that was laid down in the last summer before the tree was cut. The arcs are not perfect circles because the tree grew faster on the side that faced south toward the sun and slower on the side that faced north into the cold shadow of the hill, and this asymmetry is visible in the way the rings are wider on one side of the center and narrower on the other. This is not a flaw, but simply a record of the tree's particular place in the world, and you will account for it when you shape the staves so that the finished barrel will be true and round and strong in all directions. The smell of the wood changes slightly as you handle it, and the warmth of your hands draws out the resin that is locked inside the fibers. The resin of the black spruce is different from the resin of the pines that grow further south, and it has a sharper, cleaner scent that reminds you of the way the forest smells on a cold day in late autumn when the first snow has just fallen and the needles of the spruce trees are coated with a thin layer of frost. The scent rises from the staves, and it mingles with the smell of the wood smoke from the hearth and the faint brine smell that always lingers in the cooperage, no matter how many times you sweep the floor or open the door to let in the fresh air. This combination of smells is the smell of winter in the outport, and it is as familiar to you as the weight of the hammer in your hand or the sound of the wind in the chimney. You take the first stave from the sorted pile and you set it on the bench with the bark side down and the smoother inner face turned up toward the light. The inner face is the side that was closest to the heart of the tree, and it is paler and more uniform in color than the outer face, with a subtle sheen that catches the light in a soft glow. You run your hand over this surface and you feel the fine texture of the wood, which is smoother than the rough outer bark, but still shows the faint ridges of the grain and the small indentations where the draw knife paused for a moment during the rough shaping in the woods. The draw knife work was done quickly and without much care for finish, because the goal at that stage was simply to remove the bulk of the waste wood and to reduce the stave to a manageable size and wait for transport down to the cooperage. The real shaping, the careful work that turns a rough billet of wood into a finished barrel stave, is done here in the quiet of the winter months, and it is done slowly and with a different kind of attention. You reach for the compass that hangs on a nail near the bench, and you open it to a width that you have memorized from years of repetition, and you begin to mark the lines on the inner face of the stave that will guide your cuts and your planing. The compass points leave 2 fine scratches in the pale wood, one along each edge of the stave, and these scratches define the width that the finished stave must have to fit properly with its neighbors in the circle of the barrel. The width is not constant from end to end, because the stave must be slightly wider in the middle to create the outward curve of the bilge, and slightly narrower at the ends to create the inward taper that allows the hoops to grip tightly. You mark these widths with small pencil lines that are barely visible in the dim light, and you check them twice, and then a third time, because a mistake made now in the quiet of the marking will become a gap in the finished barrel that no amount of tightening or caulking can ever fully close. The marking is finished, and the stave lies on the bench with its pale inner face covered in a faint network of lines and measurements that only you can read. The lines are a language that you have learned over many winters, and they tell you exactly where the wood must be removed and where it must be left thick, and where the bevel must be cut at an angle to match the curve of the barrel. You do not begin the cutting yet, because there is still more looking to do, and the looking is as important as the cutting, and perhaps more important, because a cut made without proper looking is a cut that cannot be undone. You lift the stave again, and you sight along its length, closing one eye, and letting the faint lines of the grain blur into a single impression of straightness or curve or twist that will determine how you approach the work with the plane. A twist in the grain is a subtle thing, and it is not always visible to the eye when you look directly at the surface of the wood. The grain may appear to run straight and true from end to end, but when you sight along the length you can sometimes see a gentle spiral that moves from one corner of the stave to the opposite corner over the course of its length. This spiral is the result of the way the tree grew on the hillside, with a constant wind from the sea pushing against it and causing the fibers to twist slowly around the trunk as they reached upward toward the light. A stave with a twist in the grain is not useless, but it requires a different approach when you shape it, because the plane will want to follow the twist, and if you fight against it, you will tear the wood and leave a rough surface that will never be truly smooth. Instead, you must work with the twist, allowing the plane to follow its natural path, and then adjusting the bevel and the angle of the joints to compensate for the slight deviation from perfect straightness. This is the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and in the eyes, and not in any book or any spoken instruction. And it is the knowledge that separates a barrel that holds its brine for a year or more from a barrel that weeps and stains and fails before the ship has even cleared the harbor. You set the stave back on the bench, and you walk to the door, and you open it just enough to look out at the cove and the hills beyond. The snow that fell through the night has stopped, and the ground is covered with a fresh layer of white that is about 3 inches deep and completely untracked except for the small footprints of a fox that crossed from the edge of the woods to the shore and then disappeared among the rocks. The air that comes in through the open door is cold and clean, and it smells of snow and of the sea and of the faint, sharp scent of the spruce forest on the far side of the harbor. You stand in the doorway for a long moment, letting the cold air clear your lungs and clear your mind. And then you close the door, and you lift the latch back into its catch, and you return to the bench and to the staves that wait for you in the quiet light of the winter morning. The work of the cooper is not a work that announces itself with noise or with motion. It is a work that happens in the small spaces between one breath and the next, and in the slow accumulation of shavings on the floor, and in the gradual transformation of rough wood into smooth, curved surfaces that will fit together so tightly that a single candle flame held on the inside of the finished barrel will show no glimmer of light through the joints. This transformation will take many days and many weeks, and it will happen so slowly that you will not notice it happening until one day you look at a finished barrel and you cannot quite remember the moment when the rough staves became the smooth, curved thing that stands before you. That is the nature of the winter work, and that is the nature of the wood itself, which remembers its life on the hillside and holds that memory in every ring and every knot and every faint twist of the grain, and releases it only slowly and only to the hands that know how to listen. The jointer plane hangs on its peg near the bench, and it has been hanging there for the entire winter so far without being touched. You take it down now, and you feel the weight of it settle into your hands in a way that is familiar and expected, like the weight of a well-balanced axe or the heft of a full water bucket. The plane is made from a single block of beech wood that came across the ocean in the hold of a ship many years ago because beech does not grow on this rocky island, and the wood has travelled further than most of the people who have ever lived in this outport. The beech is a pale honey colour, with a tight, straight grain that shows as faint parallel lines running the length of the tool, and it has been polished by the friction of many hands over many seasons, until it feels almost soft to the touch, even though the wood itself is hard and dense and resistant to wear. The plane iron is a thick slab of dark steel that is held in place by a wooden wedge driven into a slot that cuts diagonally through the body of the plane. The cutting edge of the iron is a thin, bright line that catches the lantern light and glints back at you like a sliver of silver set into the darker metal of the rest of the blade. You check the edge with the pad of your thumb pressing very lightly and feeling the slight catch of the sharpened steel against the ridges of your skin. The edge is good and it will cut cleanly without tearing the fibers of the spruce, but you take a moment to pass it once across the fine side of the sharpening stone anyway, because a plain iron can never be too sharp, and the extra pass costs nothing except a few seconds of time and a small amount of the oil that you keep in a little clay pot near the stone. The stone itself is a flat piece of grey novaculite that came from the same ship as the beechwood, and it sits in a wooden box lined with leather to keep it from sliding when you work. You drip a few drops of the cod liver oil onto the surface of the stone, and you spread it with your fingertip until the entire surface has a thin, even sheen. Then you set the plane iron onto the stone at the correct angle, which is a thing you do not measure with any tool, but simply feel through the position of your wrists and the tilt of your hands, because you have done this motion so many thousands of times that your body remembers the angle more reliably than any marking gauge or bevel square ever could. You push the iron forward across the stone with steady, even pressure, and the sound it makes is a soft, whispering hiss that is almost too quiet to hear unless you are listening for it. You turn the iron over and you lay the flat back side against the stone, and you make a few light passes to remove the small burr of metal that has formed on the cutting edge. And then you wipe the blade clean with a scrap of wool cloth, and you set it back into the plane and you tap the wedge tight with a small wooden mallet that hangs from a string near the bench. The first stave from the sorted pile is waiting on the bench where you left it, and you set it into the long wooden vise that is built into the end of the bench near the window. The vise is a simple thing made from 2 heavy blocks of wood, and a wooden screw with a handle that you turn to tighten the jaws against the stave. You turn the handle slowly, and you watch the jaws close around the stave until it is held firmly, but not so tightly that the wood begins to compress or bend. The stave is positioned so that the edge you want to plane is facing up and slightly towards you, and the light from the window falls across the surface at an angle that lets you see the faint pencil lines you marked the day before. You lift the plane and you set it onto the stave with the toe of the plane resting near the end closest to your body, and the heel raised slightly so that the iron is not yet touching the wood. You take a breath, and you let it out slowly, and then you push the plane forward in one long continuous motion that carries it from one end of the stave to the other. The iron bites into the wood, and a thin shaving of spruce curls up through the mouth of the plane and falls away onto the bench. The sound of the cut is a soft, steady shushing noise that rises and falls with the grain and with the pressure of your hands. And it is one of the quietest sounds in the world, and one of the most satisfying sounds if you are a person who works with wood, and with sharp tools, and with the slow patience of winter. The shaving that comes off the stave is thin enough that you can see the lantern light through it, and it has the color of pale cream with faint darker lines running through it where the iron passed over the winter growth rings. You pick up the shaving and you hold it between your fingers, and you feel how light it is, and how fragile, and how it wants to curl back into the shape it held when it was still part of the living tree. The shaving has a smell that is sharper than the smell of the rough stave, because the cutting has opened up fresh surfaces of wood that have not been exposed to the air before, and the resin inside those surfaces is still fresh and volatile, and it releases its scent into the cold air of the cooperage, like a small gift from the tree to the person who is shaping it. You make another pass with the plane, and then another, and each pass removes a shaving that is almost identical to the one before it, and the shavings begin to pile up on the bench and on the floor around your feet. The work is repetitive and slow, and it requires no thought once the rhythm has established itself. Your hands know how much pressure to apply, and your arms know the length of the stroke, and your eyes know where to look along the edge of the stave to see if the bevel is coming true to the lines you marked. Your mind is free to wander while your body does the work, and this is one of the gifts of the cooper's trade in the long winter months, when there is nothing else to think about, and nowhere else to go, and no one else to talk to. The bevel that you are planing into the edge of the stave is a subtle thing, and it is not the same from one stave to the next. The staves that will form the sides of the barrel need a bevel that angles inward toward the center of the cask, so that when they are all fitted together, the circle closes perfectly, and the joints between the staves are tight from end to end. The angle of this bevel changes slightly, depending on where in the barrel the stave will sit, because the curve of the bilge is different from the curve of the chine, and the staves must be shaped to match the particular arc of their position. You do not calculate this angle with numbers or with instruments, but instead you hold an image in your mind of the finished barrel, and you plane the bevel until it matches that image in the same way that a person might carve a spoon until it matches the idea of a spoon that exists somewhere behind their eyes. The jointer plane is long enough that it bridges across the small dips and hollows in the rough surface of the stave, and it cuts only the high spots until the entire edge is straight and true from end to end. This is the purpose of the long plane, and why it is called a jointer, because it creates the flat, straight edges that will join together to form the watertight seam of the barrel. A shorter plane would follow the dips and curves of the rough wood, and it would leave an edge that was wavy and uneven, and full of small gaps that would leak brine and spoil the fish. The long plane ignores the small variations, and it finds the true line that exists within the wood, waiting to be revealed by the steady, patient removal of everything that is not that line. You stop after a dozen passes, and you lift the stave from the vise, and you hold it up to the light, and you sight along the planed edge with one eye closed. The edge is a single straight line from end to end, and it catches the light in a thin, bright gleam that tells you the bevel is true and the surface is smooth. You run your thumb along the edge, and you feel the slight sharpness where the two planes of the bevel meet, and you nod once to yourself, and you set the stave aside on the finished pile, and you reach for the next one from the sorted stack. The work continues in this way for a long time while the light outside changes by slow degrees from the pale grey of midday to the deeper grey of afternoon. The wind has risen slightly, and it presses against the walls of the cooperage in long, slow surges that make the roof timbers creak and the lantern sway on its chain. The sound of the plane cutting the wood blends with the sound of the wind and the sound of the fire, and the whole cooperage becomes a single quiet instrument, playing a note that is almost below the threshold of hearing. You do not notice the passage of time, except that the pile of finished staves grows taller by small increments, and the pile of rough staves shrinks by the same small increments, and the shavings on the floor become deeper and softer under your boots. The shavings are not waste in the true sense, because everything in the outport has a use, and nothing is thrown away that can serve some purpose later. The long clean shavings from the jointer plane will be saved and used for kindling when you need to start the fire quickly in the morning after it is burned down to ash overnight. The shorter shavings and the splinters and the small pieces of waste wood will be spread on the floor of the chicken coop to keep the birds' feet dry and warm when the spring comes and the hens begin to lay again. Even the fine dust that settles on every surface in the cooperage will be swept up and mixed with the clay that you use to chink the cracks in the walls, because the wood dust makes the clay stronger and more resistant to crumbling when it dries. This is the way of life in a place where everything must come from the sea or from the forest, or from the small gardens that grow for only a few short months each year, and where nothing can be replaced without a long wait for the next ship to arrive from across the ocean. You pause in the planing to add a piece of wood to the fire and to stretch your back and your shoulders, which have grown stiff from the repeated motion of the plane. The stiffness is a familiar thing, and it will fade as the winter goes on and your body grows accustomed to the work, in the same way that the wood grows accustomed to the shape you are giving it. You stand by the hearth for a moment, and you look at the rows of finished staves leaning against the wall, and you count them without meaning to, because counting is something that happens on its own when there is no other conversation to occupy the mind. There are 22 staves in the finished pile, which is almost enough for a single small barrel of the size that the fishermen prefer for the best quality cod that will be sold to the merchants for the highest price. A barrel of that size needs 28 staves altogether, plus the heads and the hoops and the bung and the various small pieces that hold everything together. You return to the bench, and you take up the plane again, and you set another rough stave into the vise. This stave has a small knot near one end, and you examine it carefully in the light from the lantern, turning it so that you can see how the grain flows around the dark circle of the knot. The grain swirls and dips around the knot in a way that is beautiful to look at, but difficult to plane because the iron will want to catch on the changing direction of the fibers and tear out small chunks of wood instead of cutting cleanly. You adjust your grip on the plane and you change the angle of the cut very slightly so that the iron meets the wood at a skew rather than straight on, and you make your passes with a lighter touch, letting the weight of the plane do the work rather than pressing down with your hands. The skew cut slices across the swirling grain rather than pushing into it, and the shavings that come off are still thin and even, and the surface they leave behind is smooth and without tear out. The knot itself is a small dark eye in the pale wood, and it will remain there in the finished stave because there is no way to remove it without making the stave too thin or cutting away so much wood that the stave would no longer match its neighbors in the circle of the barrel. A barrel with a knot in one of its staves is not a flawed barrel because the knot is small and sound, and it will not leak if the joint is made properly and the hoops are driven tight. The fishermen who will fill this barrel with salted cod in the summer will not notice the knot, and if they do notice it, they will not think anything of it, because they have seen 1,000 barrels with 1,000 knots, and they know that the only thing that matters is whether the barrel holds its brine and keeps the fish from spoiling. The afternoon fades into evening while you are still working, and the light from the window dims until it is no longer bright enough to see the fine details of the grain and the faint pencil lines on the surface of the wood. You set the plane down on the bench with the iron facing away from you so that you will not cut yourself if you reach for it in the dark, and you light a second lantern from the flame of the first one, and you hang it from a hook closer to the bench. The new lantern casts a warm circle of yellow light that overlaps with the circle from the first lantern, and the two circles together make a pool of brightness around the bench while the rest of the cooperage remains in soft shadow. You work for another hour by the lantern light, and the quality of the work does not change because the light is steady and your hands know what to do without needing to see every small detail. The sound of the plane in the evening is the same as the sound of the plane in the morning, and the shavings that fall onto the floor are the same pale color, and the same thin curl, and the same thin curl, and the same faint scent of spruce resin, released by the cutting edge of the iron. The only difference is that the world outside the cooperage has grown completely dark now, and the window shows nothing but a deep black square that reflects the lantern flames back at you in two small wavering points of light. You finish the last stave of the day, and you set it on the finished pile, and you step back from the bench and you look at what you have accomplished. The pile of finished staves is taller than it was this morning, and the pile of rough staves is smaller, and the floor is covered with a fresh layer of pale shavings that crunch softly under your boots when you walk to the hearth to bank the fire for the night. You arrange the coals with the iron poker pulling them together into a compact mound, and you cover them with a thick layer of ash so that they will burn slowly through the night and still be alive in the morning when you wake and need to start the fire again. The ash is soft and grey, and it drifts up in a small cloud when you move it, and it settles back down onto the coals like a blanket being drawn up over a sleeping child. You blow out one of the lanterns and then the other, and the cooperage falls into a darkness that is almost complete, except for the faint red glow of the banked coals showing through the cracks in the ash covering. You stand in the darkness for a moment, and you listen to the sounds of the night, which are the same sounds that you have heard every night since the last boat sailed south. The wind is still pressing against the walls in long, slow surges, and the roof timbers are still creaking in response, and the ice in the cove is still making its thin, high-ringing sound as it thickens and shifts in the cold. The shavings on the floor are settling into their new positions with small rustling noises that are too quiet to hear unless you are standing perfectly still in the dark and listening for them. The jointer plane is back on its peg, where it will wait for the morning, and the finished staves are leaning against the wall, where they will wait for the next step in the long, slow process of becoming a barrel. The work is not finished, and it will not be finished for many days yet, but the work that was done today was good work, and it has moved the barrel one small step closer to completion. This is the rhythm of the winter in the cooperage by the frozen sea, and it is a rhythm that will continue day after day, without change and without hurry, until the wood has been shaped and the barrel has been raised and the spring has come and the first sail has appeared on the horizon, bringing the world back to this quiet place. The frost line has moved deeper into the ground overnight, and you can feel it through the soles of your boots when you step outside to gather an armload of firewood from the pile beside the cooperage door. The earth is frozen hard as iron, and the thin layer of snow that fell 2 days ago has compacted into a crust that crunches with a sound like walking on broken eggshells. The cold air burns the inside of your nose when you breathe, and it turns your breath into clouds of white vapor that hang in the still air for a long moment before they fade into the general grey of the morning. You do not linger outside because there is no reason to linger, and because the warmth of the cooperage is waiting for you just beyond the heavy spruce door, with its wooden latch and its iron catch and its familiar creak when you push it closed behind you. The fire in the hearth has burned down to a bed of soft grey ash, with a few small coals still glowing orange-red at the very bottom where the ash is thinnest. You kneel on the packed earth floor and you use the iron poker to scrape the ash aside carefully so that you do not smother the remaining coals, and you lay small pieces of dry spruce kindling across them in a loose crisscross pattern. The kindling catches almost immediately, and the flames rise up pale yellow and orange, and they make a soft rushing sound as they find the fresh air and the dry wood. You add larger pieces of split spruce branch one at a time, and you watch the fire grow until it is a steady, compact blaze that fills the corner of the room with warmth and with the familiar smell of burning resin. The work of the day is different from the work of the days before, because you have finished planing the bevels on all the staves for the first barrel of the winter, and now you must turn your attention to the hoops that will hold those staves together during the raising of the barrel. These are not the permanent iron hoops that will bind the finished cask for its journey across the ocean, but rather the temporary wooden hoops called truss hoops that are used to gather the staves into a rough circle and to hold them in place while the shape is refined and the permanent bands are fitted. The truss hoops are made from green wood that is still flexible and full of sap, because dry wood would snap when you try to bend it into a circle, and the whole process would have to begin again with new material. The hazel for the truss hoops was cut in a late autumn before the first hard freeze, and it has been stored under a pile of wet spruce boughs behind the cooperage, where the cold and the damp have kept the wood from drying out. You go out now and you pull back the frozen boughs and you select several long straight withes of hazel from the pile beneath. The hazel is a pale grey-brown color with smooth bark that peels away in thin papery strips when you rub it with your thumb. The withes are about as thick as your finger at the base, and they taper gradually toward the tip, and they have a slight natural curve that comes from growing toward the light on the edges of the forest, where the hazel bushes form a dense understory beneath the taller spruce and fir. You carry the hazel withes inside, and you lay them on the floor near the hearth, where the warmth will begin to thaw the frozen sap and make the wood pliable again. While you wait for the wood to warm, you take down the tools that you will need for making the hoops, and you arrange them on the bench in the order that you will use them. There is a small sharp hatchet for trimming the withes to length, and for shaving down the thick ends so that they will bend evenly. There is a curved draw knife that you use to smooth the bark and to reduce the thickness of the withes in the places where they need to be more flexible. There is a wooden former, which is simply a section of old barrel stave with a groove cut into its edge that you use to check the curve of the hoop as you work it into shape. And there is a coil of thin willow withes that you use to tie the ends of the hoop together once it has been bent into a circle. The first hazel wither has warmed enough that you can bend it slightly without hearing the sharp crack of frozen fibers breaking. You pick it up and you run it through your hands, feeling the texture of the bark and the slight bumps where small twigs once grew and the gradual taper from the thick end to the thin end. You decide where the hoop will begin and end, and you mark these points with a small nick from the hatchet, so that you will not lose your place when you are working the wood with the draw knife. The thick end of the weave needs to be reduced so that it will bend at the same rate as the thinner sections. And this is a job for the draw knife and for the patience that you have learned over many winters. You sit on the low stool near the hearth with a hazel withe across your knees, and you set the blade of the draw knife against the bark, and you pull it toward you in a long, smooth stroke. The bark peels away in a thin strip that curls up like a wood shaving, but darker and more fibrous, and it falls to the floor among the spruce shavings from the planing work. The wood beneath the bark is a pale greenish-white color, and it is smooth and slightly damp to the touch from the sap that is still moving through the fibers even though the bush was cut weeks ago. You make several more passes with the draw knife, taking off thin layers of wood until the thick end of the withe is reduced to a thickness that matches the middle section, and the whole length of the hoopstock has a uniform flexibility that will allow it to bend into a smooth circle without flat spots or sudden kinks. The bending of the hoop is a slow process that cannot be rushed any more than the planing of the staves can be rushed. You hold the withe in both hands with the ends pointing away from you, and you begin to apply steady, even pressure in the middle, pushing outward with your thumbs while your fingers pull the ends toward each other. The wood resists at first, and then it begins to yield, and you feel the fibers stretching and compressing in ways that they have not done since the hazel was a living branch, reaching up toward the light. You bend the withe a little further, and you hold it there for a count of 20 while the wood adjusts to its new shape, and then you release the pressure and you let it spring back part way. You repeat this process again and again, bending a little further each time and holding a little longer, until the width has taken on a permanent curve that approximates the circle of the truss hoop. The sound of the bending is a soft creaking noise that is almost too quiet to hear over the crackle of the fire and the distant moan of the wind. The creaking is the sound of the wood fibers sliding past each other and rearranging themselves into a new configuration, and it is a sound that you have heard many hundreds of times before. When the curve of the width is close to the curve of the wooden former, you stop bending and you hold the hoop up to the light and you sight along its edge, looking for any flat spots or irregularities that will need to be corrected. A truss hoop does not need to be perfectly round, because its only job is to hold the staves together while you work, and it will be removed once the permanent iron bands are in place. But a hoop that is too far out of round will pull the staves into an uneven shape, and that uneven shape will become locked into the barrel when the iron hoops are driven tight, and the finished cask will be lopsided and difficult to roll, and it will not stack properly in the hold of a ship. You make small adjustments to the curve by bending the withe over your knee in the places where the circle is too flat, and by pressing it against the edge of the bench in the places where the curve is too sharp. Each adjustment is small and incremental, and you check the result against the former after each one until the hoop matches the groove in the former closely enough that you cannot see any gaps between the wood and the guide. Then you take one of the thin willow withes from the coil, and you soak it in the pail of water near the hearth until it is soft and pliable, and you wrap it tightly around the overlapping ends of the hazel hoop. You tie the withe in a simple knot, and you trim the loose ends with the hatchet, and you set the finished truss hoop aside on the floor, where it will wait for the day when you raise the first barrel of the winter. The making of the truss hoops is a repetitive task that fills the hours of the short winter day without requiring much thought or attention. Your hands know what to do, and your eyes know where to look, and your mind is free to drift while the work continues in its steady rhythm. You trim another withe and you shave it with the draw knife, and you bend it slowly over your knee and you check it against the former, and you tie it with a willow withe and you set it aside with the others. The pile of finished hoops grows slowly on the floor beside the bench, and the pile of rough hazel withes shrinks by the same slow increments, and the shavings and bark strips accumulate around your feet in a dry, fragrant litter that crunches softly when you shift your weight on the stool. The light outside has changed while you have been working, and it has gone from the pale grey of morning to the slightly brighter grey of midday, and then back to the deeper grey of afternoon. The window in the west wall shows nothing but a square of flat uniform colour that tells you nothing about the passage of time, except that it is not yet dark enough to light the lanterns. You work by the light of the fire and the light from the window, and this is enough for the making of hoops, because the work does not require the same precision as the planing of the stave bells, and a small variation in the curve of a truss hoop will not matter in the end. The frost line outside has continued its slow advance into the ground while you have been sitting by the fire, and you can see evidence of it on the inside of the window where a thin layer of ice has formed on the oiled linen. The ice is not thick enough to obscure the light completely, but it has a faint crystalline texture that catches the grey glow and breaks it into small prismatic sparkles that shift and change as you move your head. The temperature inside the cooperage is warm enough near the hearth that you have removed your heavy outer coat, and you're working in just your wool shirt and your knit cap, and your hands are warm and flexible from the heat of the fire. But beyond the circle of warmth, the air is cold and still, and you can feel the difference when you stand up and walk to the door to check the weather. You open the door just wide enough to look out, and you see that the cove is completely frozen now from the shore out to the narrow entrance where the tide still moves beneath the ice and keeps a small channel open. The ice is grey and rough, and it has a matte surface that reflects the overcast sky without any shine or sparkle. The hills on the far side of the harbour are white with snow and dark with the bare branches of the winter trees, and they look like a drawing made with charcoal on pale paper, with no other colours except the grey and the white and the black of the rock outcrops where the wind has scoured the snow away. You close the door, and you lift the latch back into its catch, and you return to the stool by the hearth and to the pile of hazel withes and to the slow, steady work of the winter afternoon. The fire needs another piece of wood, and you select a split length of spruce from the pile beside the hearth, and you lay it carefully across the andirons so that it will catch the flames but not smother them. The new wood is dry and full of resin, and it begins to burn almost immediately, with a bright yellow flame that sends a shower of small sparks at the chimney. The sparks are tiny points of orange light that rise and swirl in the draught and then fade into darkness before they reach the top of the stone chimney. You watch them for a moment, and then you return your attention to the hazel weed in your hands and to the slow bending that will transform it from a straight branch into a curved hoop. The pail of water near the hearth has developed a thin skin of ice on its surface, even though it sits within the circle of warmth. You notice this when you reach for a willow withy, and you see the faint glint of the ice catching the firelight. You break the ice with your fingertip, and it shatters into small flat pieces that float on the surface of the water, like tiny panes of glass. The water beneath is cold but not frozen, and you soak the withy in it until the fibers soften and become flexible enough to tie without snapping. The cold water makes your fingers ache after a few moments, and you pull them out and you warm them over the fire until the ache fades and the feeling returns to the tips. The afternoon passes into evening without any noticeable transition, except that the square of the window changes from grey to deep blue and then to black, and you realize that you have been working by firelight alone for some time without having lit the lanterns. You stand up, and you stretch your back and your shoulders, and you feel the stiffness that comes from sitting in one position for too long. You walk around the cooperage once just to move your legs, and you look at the stacks of finished staves and the rows of tools hanging on the wall, and the pile of completed truss hoops on the floor. There are 12 hoops in the pile, which is enough for 2 barrels because each barrel needs 6 truss hoops to hold the staves in place during the raising and the shaping. The hoops are not all the same size because the barrel is wider in the middle than at the ends, and the hoops must be made to match the different circumferences of the bilge, and the chime, and the quarters. You light the lanterns, and you hang them from their hooks, and you return to the stall for another hour of work, because there is no reason to stop, and because the quiet rhythm of the bending and the tying is a comfortable thing that fills the long winter evening. The fire crackles and pops, and the wind moans around the chimney, and the ice in the cove makes its thin, high ringing sound, and the hazel withes creak softly as you bend them into circles. These are the only sounds in the world, and they are enough to fill the silence without disturbing it, and they blend together into a single quiet note that hums beneath the surface of everything. When the last width of the evening has been bent and tied and added to the pile, you bank the fire for the night, and you blow out the lanterns, and you stand in the darkness of the cooperage, listening to the small, settling sounds of the cooling wood and the fading crackle of the coals. The truss hoops are ready and the staves are ready, and tomorrow or the day after you will begin the raising of the first barrel of the winter. But that is a thought for another day, and for now there is only the darkness and the warmth of the banked fire, and the sound of the wind and the slow patient waiting that is the true work of the winter in the outport by the frozen sea. The morning arrives without any change in the light, and you know that it is morning only because the fire has burned down to a bed of grey ash, and your body tells you that you have slept for enough hours to call it a new day. You rise from the low cot in the corner of the cooperage, where you sleep during the winter months, because it is warmer than the main house, and because the smell of the wood and the tools is a comfortable thing to wake to. The cot is made of spruce poles lashed together with rope, and it is covered with a thick mattress of dried seaweed and a wool blanket that has been patched so many times that the original fabric is almost impossible to find among the layers of mending. You fold the blanket, and you set it at the foot of the cot, and you walk to the hearth to stir the ashes and to find the few coals that have survived the night. The coals are there at the bottom of the ash pile, glowing a faint orange red that brightens when you blow gently across them. You add a handful of dry shavings from the pile on the floor, and you watch them catch and flare, and then you add small sticks of kindling and then larger pieces of split spruce until the fire is established and the warmth begins to spread outward from the hearth into the cold air of the room. The window is still dark, and the lantern that you left hanging from the beam last night is still dark, and the only light in the cooperage is the yellow-orange glow of the flames dancing across the surfaces of the tools and the stacks of finished staves and the pile of truss hoops waiting on the floor. Today is the day that you will raise the first barrel of the winter, and you feel a small, quiet anticipation that is not excitement, but rather a sense of something beginning after many days of preparation. You have made barrels before, many hundreds of barrels, over many winters, and the raising of a barrel is not a dramatic event. It is a slow, careful process of fitting pieces together, and adjusting, and tapping, and looking, and adjusting again, until the circle closes and the staves stand on their own without support. But there is a moment in the raising when the loose collection of individual staves becomes a single thing, a hollow vessel with a shape and a purpose, and that moment is always satisfying in a quiet way that does not require any words to describe. You eat a small breakfast of hard biscuit and a piece of dried fish that you soften in a cup of hot water from the kettle that hangs over the fire. The fish is salt cod from the summer before, and it has a firm, flaky texture and a clean, sharp taste that fills your mouth with the memory of the sea. The biscuit is hard and dry, and it takes a long time to chew. And this is good because there is no hurry, and because the slow chewing gives you time to look at the staves and the hoops and to plan the order of the work ahead. When the breakfast is finished, you rinse your cup with a splash of water from the pail, and you set it on the mantel, and you walk to the stack of finished staves, and you begin to select the ones that will form the first barrel. The selection is not random, and it is not based on any single quality, but rather on the way the staves look when they are placed side by side, and the way their grain patterns flow together, and the way their widths and thicknesses complement each other. You want the staves that will form the bilge, the widest part of the barrel, to be slightly wider than the staves that will form the chine, the ends where the heads will fit. You want the grain to run straight and true with no sudden deviations that might cause a leak. You want the color of the wood to be consistent from stave to stave, so that the finished barrel will have a uniform appearance that speaks of careful work and attention to detail. You take your time with the selection, and you set each chosen stave aside in a separate pile until you have 28 staves that you are satisfied with. The first truss hoop is the smallest one, and it will hold the staves together at the top end of the barrel before the head is fitted. You pick it up from the pile of finished hoops, and you test its strength by pressing your hands against opposite sides and feeling the resistance of the hazel wood and the tightness of the willow binding. The hoop is strong enough to hold the staves in place, but flexible enough that you can force it down the widening cone of the barrel as the shape takes form. You set the hoop on the floor in the center of the open space near the bench, and you stand it on its edge so that it forms a circle on the packed earth. The first stave is the keystone of the raising, and it must be placed carefully because all the other staves will lean against it and take their orientation from its position. You select a stave that is straight and true, and you set it inside the truss hoop with its lower end resting on the floor and its upper end leaning outward at an angle. The hoop is too small to hold the stave upright on its own, and the stave would fall over if you let go of it. But you do not let go. You hold it with one hand, and you reach for the second stave with the other, and you set it beside the first one so that the two staves lean against each other like the first two poles of a tippy. The joint between them is not tight yet, because the bevels have not been adjusted to the exact angle of the finished barrel. But it is close enough that the two staves support each other, and you can take your hand away and they will remain standing. The third stave goes beside the second and the fourth beside the third, and you work your way around the circle, adding one stave at a time and adjusting the spacing with small taps of your palm against the wood. The staves lean outward like the petals of a flower that has not yet opened, and the truss hoop sits loosely around them about a handspan down from the top ends. The sound of the work is a soft clatter of wood against wood as you fit each new stave into place, and the occasional thump of your palm against the side of a stave that has drifted out of alignment. The fire crackles in the hearth, and the wind moans around the chimney, and the ice in the cove makes its thin ringing sound, and these are the only noises in the world. When all 28 staves are standing inside the truss hoop, the circle is complete, but it is not yet a barrel. The staves are spaced unevenly, and some of them lean at slightly different angles, and the whole assembly has a loose, unstable quality that would collapse if you were to bump against it, or if a strong draft were to push through the door. The next step is to adjust the spacing and to tighten the truss hoop so that the staves are drawn together and the joints begin to close. You walk slowly around the circle and you look at the gaps between the staves, and you tap each one gently with the wooden mallet, moving at a fraction of an inch to the left or to the right until the gaps are as even as you can make them. The mallet is a simple tool made from a block of hard maple that came from the same ship as the beechwood plane, and it has a short handle and a heavy head that delivers a soft, controlled blow without bouncing or jarring your hand. The tapping goes on for a long time because you are not in a hurry, and because the even spacing of the staves is important for the shape of the finished barrel. A gap that is too wide will create a flat spot in the curve, and a gap that is too narrow will create a sharp angle where the staves press too tightly together, and the wood may split when the permanent hoops are driven home. You tap and you look and you tap again, and you walk around the circle and you look from every angle, and you tap some more until the staves are spaced as evenly as you can make them with the tools and the light that you have. The truss hoop is still loose, and it can be slid up and down the staves with only a small amount of effort. You grasp the hoop with both hands and you push it downward slowly, feeling the resistance increase as the widening shape of the staves presses against the inside of the hoop. The hoop moves about 6 inches down from the top ends, and then it stops, and you can push it no further without risking a split in the hazel or a broken willow binding. The pressure of the hoop against the staves has drawn them together, and the gaps between the joints have closed slightly, but they are still visible as thin lines of light that you can see when you hold the lantern close to the outside of the barrel. The second truss hoop is larger than the first, and it will sit lower on the barrel where the curve of the bilge begins to swell outward. You pick it up, and you slide it down over the top ends of the staves, and you let it rest loosely around the middle of the assembly. This hoop is not tight yet, and it serves only to keep the staves from falling outward, while you work on the spacing and the alignment of the lower ends. The lower ends of the staves are still resting on the floor, and they are splayed outward in a wide circle that is much larger than the finished diameter of the barrel will be. This is correct because the barrel must be wider in the middle than at the ends, and the staves must be forced inward at the bottom to create the tapered shape that allows the hoops to grip and the heads to fit. You pick up the heavy wooden driver, which is a block of hardwood with a groove cut into one face that fits against the edge of the truss hoop. You set the groove against the hoop and you tap the driver with the mallet, moving the hoop downward in small increments. Each tap moves the hoop a quarter of an inch or less, and you work your way around the circle, tapping and checking and tapping again. The sound of the mallet on the driver is a muffled thump that is different from the sharper sound of the mallet on the staves, and it echoes off the log walls and fades into the general hush of the cooperage. The hoop moves down, and the staves are drawn closer together, and the gaps between the joints continue to close. The third truss hoop is the largest, and it will sit at the widest part of the bilge where the barrel swells outward in a smooth, continuous curve. You slide it down from the top, and you position it roughly where you think the bilge should be, based on the shape of the staves and the memory of 1,000 other barrels. Then you pick up the driver again, and you tap the hoop downward slowly and carefully, working around the circle and watching the shape of the barrel change as the staves bend inward and the curve of the bilge begins to emerge from the straight, rough staves. This is the moment when the barrel begins to look like a barrel and not just a collection of loose boards leaning together in a circle. The bending of the staves is not a violent process because the spruce is flexible and full of resin, and it yields to the pressure of the hoops without cracking or splitting. The sound of the bending is a soft creaking groan that is almost below the threshold of hearing, and it is the same sound that the hazel withers made when you bend them into hoops a few days before. The wood is learning its new shape and the fibers are sliding past each other and rearranging themselves, and this takes time and cannot be rushed. You tap the hoop and you wait, and you listen, and you tap again, and the barrel slowly takes form under your hands. The lower ends of the staves are still splayed outward, and they will need to be drawn in with another truss hoop that you will fit from the bottom up. You lift the entire assembly carefully, and you tip it onto its side, and you slide a fourth hoop up from the bottom end until it sits just below the swelling of the bilge. Then you stand the barrel upright again, and you tap this bottom hoop upward with the driver working around the circle and watching the lower ends of the staves draw together until they form a circle that matches the circle at the top. The barrel now has 4 truss hoops in place, 1 at the top, 1 at the bottom, and 2 in the middle, and it stands on its own without any support. And it looks like a barrel, although the joints are still open and the shape is not yet final. The next step is the cutting of the crest, which is the groove inside the top end of the barrel that will hold the head in place. You take down the crows from its peg on the wall and you examine the blade in the lantern light to make sure that it is sharp and clean and free of any nicks or burrs that might tear the wood. The crows is a strange-looking tool with a curved guide that rides along the inside of the staves and a small saw blade that cuts a groove of a precise depth and width. You set the guide against the inside of the barrel about 1.5 inches down from the top edge, and you begin to push the tool around the circle slowly and steadily, letting the saw teeth bite into the spruce and cut a clean channel. The sound of the crows is a soft rasping noise that rises and falls with the grain of the wood, and it is a sound that you have heard many thousands of times before. You work your way around the circle 1 stave at a time, and you can feel the resistance change as the blade moves from the softer summer wood to the harder winter rings and back again. The groove that you are cutting must be the same depth all the way around so that the head will seat evenly and the barrel will be watertight. You stop frequently to check the depth with your fingertip and to clear the sawdust from the groove with a small brush made from the tail of a fox that you found dead on the hillside 2 winters ago. The cutting of the crest takes a long time because the circle is large and the tool is small, and you cannot hurry the saw blade without risking a crooked cut or a broken tooth. You work in the lantern light with the fire crackling in the hearth and the wind moaning around the chimney, and the barrel standing silent and patient in the center of the room, waiting for you to finish. The sawdust from the crows falls into the inside of the barrel and piles up on the floor in a small drift of fine pale particles that smell sharply of fresh spruce resin and of the work of your hands. When the crest is finished, you set the crows back on its peg, and you stand back from the barrel, and you look at what you have made so far. The staves are drawn together, and the shape is true, and the groove is cut, and the barrel stands on its own 4 hoops like a living thing that has just learned to balance. The joints between the staves are still visible as thin dark lines, and they will need to be tightened further with the permanent iron hoops before the barrel will hold water or brine. But the raising is complete, and the barrel exists now as a single object, with a shape and a purpose, and the rest of the work is refinement and finishing. You walk around the barrel one more time and you run your hand over the outside surface, feeling the slight ridges where the staves meet and the smooth curves of the wood between the joints. The surface is rough from the draw knife and the plane, and it will need to be sanded smooth before the barrel is finished. But that is work for another day. For now the barrel is raised and it stands in the center of the cooperage in the warm circle of the lantern light, and it is a good barrel, and it will hold salt cod and brine, and it will travel across the ocean to a warm port where the fish will be eaten by people who have never seen this frozen outport and who will never know the name of the cooper who made the barrel that held their dinner. You add a piece of wood to the fire and you sit on the stool and you look at the barrel for a long time without moving or speaking or thinking any particular thoughts. The wind shifts outside and the chimney draw changes pitch by a small degree, and the lantern sways on its chain, and the shadows move across the walls. The barrel stands in the center of the room, and it is a simple thing made of spruce and hazel and thyme, and it is enough. Tomorrow you will fit the iron hoops, and the day after that you will make the head, and the day after that you will sand the outside smooth, and the winter will continue in this way, one day following another, until the ice breaks and the first sail appears and the world returns to this quiet place. But tonight there is only the barrel and the fire and the wind and the long, slow silence of the winter night in the cooperage by the frozen sea. The barrel stands in the center of the cooperage where you left it the night before, and it has not moved because there is no wind inside the room, and no reason for a barrel to move once it has been raised and set upon the packed earth floor. The 4 truss hoops are still in place, and the staves are still drawn together in a rough approximation of a barrel shape, and the crest groove is still cut clean and true around the inside of the top end. The morning light through the oiled linen window is the same pale grey that it has been for many days now, and it falls across the barrel in a soft diffuse glow that highlights the ridges of the joints and the faint pencil lines that you have not yet sanded away. The next step in the making of the barrel is a step that involves fire and heat and the careful application of warmth to the inside of the wooden shell, so that the fibers become pliable and the shape can be refined and tightened. This is called trussing, and it is one of the oldest parts of the cooper's trade, going back to a time before iron hoops, and before the long planes, and before the outport, and before the ships that brought the beechwood and the novaculite across the ocean. The trussing fire is a small contained thing not much larger than a handful of kindling, and it is lit inside the open barrel casing, where it burns slowly and steadily and sends its warmth outward into the wood. You gather the materials for the trussing fire from the piles and scraps that have accumulated around the cooperage over the past weeks. There is a basket of dry shavings from the jointer plane, the long pale curls that are thin enough to read the lantern light through and that catch a spark almost instantly. There are small splinters of spruce that broke off during the raising of the staves, and that are too small to be used for anything except kindling. There are a few pieces of dry bark that fell from the rough staves when you handled them, and that have been sitting in a pile near the hearth, waiting for a purpose. You take a handful of each, and you carry them to the barrel and you drop them through the open top end, so that they fall to the bottom of the interior, and form a small loose pile on the floor inside. The barrel has no bottom head yet, because the head will be fitted after the trussing is complete, and after the shape of the barrel has been locked into place by the permanent iron hoops. The open bottom allows air to flow up through the barrel and feed the small fire, and it also allows you to reach inside and arrange the kindling and to check the progress of the burn without disturbing the staves. You kneel on the packed earth floor and you peer into the dark interior of the barrel, and you can see the small pile of shavings and splinters and bark glowing faintly in the light that comes down from the open top. The interior smells of fresh cut spruce and of the faint resin that has been released by the planing and the cutting, and it is a clean, sharp smell that reminds you of the forest on a cold morning. You light a small splinter of dry pine from the hearth fire, and you carry it carefully across the room with the flame flickering and dancing at the tip. You hold the burning splinter down through the open top of the barrel, and you touch it to the pile of shavings, and you watch the flame catch and spread and grow. The shavings ignite with a soft whoosh that is almost too quiet to hear, and the fire begins to consume the dry wood with small yellow flames that cast flickering shadows on the inside of the staves. The light from the fire inside the barrel is contained and muted, and it glows through the thin gaps between the joints in thin lines of orange gold that trace the shape of each stave like the veins of a leaf held up to the sun. The trussing fire is not meant to be a large fire because too much heat will scorch the wood and make it brittle and prone to cracking when the hoops are driven tight. The fire must be just large enough to warm the staves and to make the resin flow and to soften the lignin that binds the wood fibers together. You watch the flames for a moment and you judge the size and the intensity, and you decide that it is right. Then you stand up and you step back from the barrel and you let the fire do its work while you prepare the next steps of the trussing. The heat from the small fire rises up through the barrel and it warms the air inside, and the warmth spreads outward into the staves by slow degrees. You can feel the change in temperature when you place your palm against the outside of the barrel, and you can feel the wood growing warmer and more pliable under your hand. The spruce begins to release its stored resin in response to the heat, and the smell of the smoke changes from the dry, sharp scent of burning shavings to a richer, sweeter smell that is the essence of the tree itself. This smell fills the cooperage, and it mingles with the smell of the hearth fire and the smell of the cold sea air that seeps in through the chinking, and it creates a complex, layered fragrance that is the smell of winter and of work and of the long, slow passage of time. The smoke from the trussing fire rises up through the open top of the barrel, and it forms a thin column of pale grey that drifts toward the rafters and then spreads out and hangs in a flat layer just below the roof. The smoke is not thick enough to be choking or to make your eyes water, but it is present, and it adds a soft haze to the air that catches the lantern light and diffuses it into a gentle glow. The rafters of the cooperage are blackened with the smoke of many winters and many trussing fires, and they have a soft, velvety texture that comes from the accumulation of fine soot particles over the years. The smoke today will add another thin layer to that accumulation, and it will become part of the history of the cooperage, in the same way that the shavings on the floor and the wear on the bench and the patina on the tool handles are part of that history. You let the fire burn for a time while you stand by the bench and you watch the barrel and you listen to the small sounds that it makes as it warms. The wood expands with the heat, and the staves press more tightly against each other, and the gaps between the joints narrow by tiny increments that you cannot see, but that you know are happening. The sound of this expansion is a soft creaking and popping that is similar to the sounds the roof timbers make when the wind presses against the building. These are the sounds of wood adjusting to a new condition, and they are familiar sounds that do not alarm you or require any response. When the fire has burned for long enough that the outside of the barrel is warm to the touch, all the way around you decide that it is time to tighten the truss hoops further. The heat has made the spruce more flexible, and the fibers will yield to the pressure of the hoops without splitting or cracking. You pick up the heavy wooden driver and the mallet, and you approach the barrel and you set the groove of the driver against the topmost truss hoop. You tap the driver with the mallet using the same slow, careful rhythm that you used when you first raised the barrel. Each tap moves the hoop down the widening cone of the staves by a small fraction of an inch, and the pressure of the hoop draws the staves closer together, and the joints tighten, and the shape of the barrel becomes more defined. The sound of the mallet on the driver is a muffled thump that is absorbed by the warm wood, and it does not echo or ring, but rather fades quickly into the general hush of the room. You work your way around the top hoop, tapping and checking and tapping again, until the hoop has moved down another inch or two and it is seated firmly against the swelling curve of the bilge. Then you move to the second hoop, and you repeat the process, and then the third and the fourth, working from the top down and from the bottom up until all 4 truss hoops have been tightened by the same small amount. The trussing fire inside the barrel has burned down to a bed of glowing coals, and the flames have disappeared, and the light that shines through the joints has changed from orange gold to a deep, steady red. The smoke has thinned, and it no longer rises in a column, but drifts lazily from the top of the barrel in small wisps that curl and twist in the faint draughts of the room. You kneel down, and you look through the open bottom of the barrel, and you see the coals glowing on the floor inside. And you judge that they are still hot enough to continue warming the wood, but not so hot that they will scorch or char the interior surface. You add a few more shavings and a small piece of dry bark to the coals, and you watch them catch and flare briefly, and then settle back into a steady glow. The process of trussing a barrel is not a process that can be completed in a single session. The wood needs time to absorb the heat and to adjust to its new shape, and then it needs to cool slowly so that the shape becomes fixed and permanent. You will tighten the hoops several more times over the course of the day, and you will feed the trussing fire with small additions of fuel to keep the warmth steady and even. The work of the cooper is a work of patience and of small increments and of waiting for the wood to tell you when it is ready for the next step. You sit on the low stool near the hearth, and you let the barrel stand in the center of the room with its small fire glowing inside, and its hoops tight and its shape emerging from the rough staves like a figure emerging from a block of stone. The warmth from the trussing fire adds to the warmth from the hearth, and the cooperage is warmer than it has been on any day since the last boat sailed south. The warmth is a comfortable thing, and it makes you aware of the cold that has been your constant companion for so many weeks. You remove your wool coat and you hang it on a peg near the door, and you sit in your wool shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and you feel the warmth on your arms and on your face. The day outside continues in its slow grey way, and the light through the window changes by small degrees from the pale grey of morning to the slightly brighter grey of midday. The square of oiled linen shows nothing of the world beyond except the colour of the sky, and that colour tells you nothing except that the clouds are still thick and low, and the sun is still hidden somewhere above them. The wind has dropped, and the cove is silent, and the only sounds are the sounds inside the cooperage, which are the crackle of the hearth-fire, and the soft hiss of the trussing coals, and the occasional creak of the barrel staves, as they adjust to the heat and the pressure. You stand up after a time, and you walk to the barrel, and you place your palm against the outside, and you feel the warmth radiating through the wood. The surface is smooth and dry, and it is warmer than your own skin, and the sensation is pleasant in a simple physical way that requires no thought or interpretation. You pick up the driver and the mallet again, and you tap the top hoop another half-inch down the curve, and you feel the resistance increase as the staves press more tightly together. The hoop moves reluctantly now, and each tap produces only a small movement, and you know that you are approaching the limit of what the truss hoops can do without the support of the permanent iron bands. The trussing fire has burned down to ash, and the coals are dark and cold, and the inside of the barrel is filled with a fine grey powder that you will sweep out before you fit the head. The smoke has cleared completely, and the air in the cooperage is still and warm, and it smells of spruce resin and of wood smoke, and of the faint clean scent of the cold sea that always finds its way through the chinking. You let the barrel cool slowly for the rest of the afternoon, and you do no more work on it because the wood needs time to settle and to accept its new shape. You spend the time instead on small tasks that need doing, such as sharpening the draw knife and oiling the jointer plane, and sorting through the remaining rough staves to find the ones that will become the heads for this barrel, and for the barrels that will follow. The head staves are different from the side staves because they must be straight and flat, and they will be joined edge to edge with wooden dowels to form a solid disc that fits into the crest groove. You select several white straight staves from the pile, and you set them aside near the bench where they will wait for the day when you turn your attention to the making of the heads. That day is not today, and it may not be tomorrow, but it will come in its own time, and the staves will be ready when it comes. The afternoon fades into evening, and the grey light through the window deepens to blue, and then to black, and you light the lanterns and you hang them from their hooks, and you stand in the warm glow, and you look at the barrel. It is cooled now, and the shape is set, and the staves are tight together, and the joints are closed, and the barrel is ready for the iron hoops. The iron hoops are stored in a corner of the cooperage, where they have been waiting since they were made by the blacksmith in Fairyland 2 summers ago. They are heavy and dark, with a thin bloom of rust from the salt air, and they are coiled in a stack like sleeping snakes, waiting for the warmth of the spring to wake them. You do not fetch the iron hoops tonight, because the work of the day is done, and because the barrel needs to rest, and because you need to rest. You bank the fire in the hearth, and you blow out one of the lanterns, and you leave the other burning low on its hook, so that you will have light if you wake in the night. The barrel stands in the center of the room in the soft glow of the single lantern, and it is a good barrel, and it will hold salt cod and brine, and it will cross the ocean, and it will serve its purpose, and then it will be broken up for firewood, or used as a planter in some warm garden, far from this frozen shore. But that is in the future, and the future is not something that you think about in the long winter nights. There is only the barrel and the fire and the wind and the slow steady rhythm of the days as they pass one after another in the quiet of the cooperage by the frozen sea. The iron hoops have been waiting in the corner of the cooperage since before the first snow fell, and they have grown a thin skin of rust that colours them the deep orange-brown of autumn leaves fallen on a forest path. You lift the first hoop from the stack, and you feel the weight of it pulling against your arm, and you understand again why the wooden truss hoops are used for the raising and the shaping, because no man could hold a full set of iron bands in place while the staves were still loose and unformed. The iron is cold, and it draws the warmth from your hands even through the wool of your mitts, and you carry it to the bench where you lay it flat, and you look at it for a long moment before you begin the work of fitting it to the barrel. The hoop is not a perfect circle, because it was made by the blacksmith in Fairyland 2 summers past, and the blacksmith shaped it by eye and by experience, rather than by measurement and calculation. It is slightly oval in one direction, and slightly flat in another, and it will need to be adjusted to match the exact circumference of the barrel at the point where it will sit. You have done this many times before, and you know that the adjustment is not a matter of bending the iron cold, because cold iron will snap or crack or spring back to its original shape as soon as you release the pressure. The iron must be heated until it glows a dull red, and then it can be worked with the hammer and the anvil, and then it must be cooled slowly so that it holds its new shape without becoming brittle. The small anvil sits on a block of fir near the hearth, and it is a simple thing with a flat top and a rounded horn and a square hole for holding small tools. The surface of the anvil is polished bright by the repeated blows of the hammer, and it reflects the firelight in a warm silver glow that is different from the dull rusted surface of the iron hoops. You pick up the anvil and you set it closer to the hearth where the heat from the fire will help to keep the iron warm while you work, and you arrange the hammers and the tongs and the small bucket of water that you use for quenching and the leather apron that you wear to protect your clothing from the sparks. The first iron hoop is the chime hoop that will sit at the very top of the barrel just above the crest groove, and it must fit tightly enough that it cannot be moved by hand, but not so tightly that it crushes the wood or prevents the head from seating properly. You measure the circumference of the barrel at the chime with a leather thong that you have kept for this purpose, and you mark the length on the thong with a small scratch from your knife. Then you lay the thong along the inside of the iron hoop, and you see that the hoop is slightly too large and that it will need to be reduced by perhaps half an inch to make the fit snug. The reduction is done by cutting the hoop at the joint where the ends overlap and then reheating and reshaping the iron and riveting it back together in a slightly smaller circle. The joint of the iron hoop is a simple lap joint where the two ends of the flat iron bar overlap for about 3 inches and are held together by 2 iron rivets that pass through holes drilled in the metal. You examine the rivets in the light from the hearth, and you see that they are tight and sound and that the holes are clean and round with no cracks or rust weakening the metal around them. You take up the small cold chisel and the hammer and you position the chisel against the head of the first rivet, and you strike it once sharply to cut through the soft iron. The rivet head shears off and falls to the floor with a small clink, and you do the same to the second rivet, and then you pry the overlapping ends apart with the tip of the chisel, and the hoop is open and ready to be reshaped. The forge for this work is not a proper forge with bellows and a deep bed of coals, but simply the hearth fire itself with the iron laid across the andirons where the flames are hottest. You set the open hoop into the fire, and you watch the rust bloom change color as the metal heats first to a dull brown and then to a deeper red and finally to a glowing orange that is almost the color of the coals beneath it. The iron gives off a faint smell as it heats a dry metallic scent that is not unpleasant and that mingles with the smell of the burning spruce and the lingering fragrance of the trussing fire from the day before. You wait until the iron is hot enough that you can see the surface beginning to shimmer, and then you lift it from the fire with the tongs and you carry it to the anvil. The sound of the hammer on the hot iron is different from the sound of the mallet on the wooden driver, and it is different from the sound of the plane on the spruce stave. It is a clear ringing note that fills the cooperage and echoes off the log walls and fades slowly into the general hush of the room. You strike the iron with steady measured blows, working your way along the curve of the hoop and adjusting the shape by small degrees. The hot metal yields under the hammer, and the oval becomes more round and the flat spot becomes a smooth curve, and you check your progress frequently by holding the hoop up to the barrel and sighting along its edge. The work is not hurried because the iron will stay hot for only a short time, and then it must be returned to the fire and heated again, and this cycle of heating and hammering and checking will repeat several times before the hoop fits correctly. The second sound that joins the ringing of the hammer is the soft hiss of the hot iron when you dip it briefly into the quenching bucket to cool a small section that you do not want to bend further. The water in the bucket is cold, and it has a thin skin of ice around the edges, and the hot iron sends up a small cloud of steam that smells of hot metal and of the minerals in the water and of the faint residue of the quenching that has accumulated over many seasons. The steam rises and twists in the air, and then it fades, and you return the iron to the fire, and you wait for it to heat again, and you watch the flames dance, and you listen to the wind outside, and you think about nothing in particular. When the hoop is finally the correct size and shape, you must join the ends together again, and this is done by heating the overlapping section to a bright yellow heat and then hammering the 2 layers of iron together on the anvil until they are fused into a single piece. This is called a forge weld, and it requires a certain skill and a certain timing because the iron must be hot enough to stick to itself, but not so hot that it burns and becomes brittle and useless. You watch the color of the metal carefully, and you turn the hoop in the fire so that the overlapping ends heat evenly, and when the color is right, a bright yellow, white, that is almost painful to look at you. Lift the hoop with the tongs, and you carry it to the anvil, and you strike it once 3 times with quick light blows that drive the layers together and fuse them into a single piece. The weld is not visible when it is finished, because the hammer blows have smoothed the surface and the 2 pieces of iron have become one piece, with no seam or joint that you can see or feel. You check the weld by tapping it with the hammer and listening to the sound it makes, which should be a clear ring with no dead thud that would indicate a hidden crack or a poor fusion. The sound is good, and you nod once and you set the hoop aside to cool slowly on the hearthstones, where the warmth of the fire will prevent it from cooling too quickly and becoming brittle. The second iron hoop is the quarter hoop that will sit lower on the barrel, where the curve of the bilge begins to swell outward, and it must be slightly larger than the chime hoop. You measure the circumference of the barrel at the quarter with the leather thong, and you mark the length, and you compare it to the second iron hoop from the stack. This hoop is also too large, and it will need to be cut and reshaped and welded in the same way as the first hoop. You repeat the process of cutting the rivets with the cold chisel and the hammer, and you open the hoop and you lay it in the fire and you wait for it to heat, and you watch the flames and you listen to the wind. The repetition of the work is a comfortable thing because it requires no thought and no decision and no judgment beyond the simple observation of the color of the hot iron and the sound of the hammer on the anvil. Your hands know what to do, and your eyes know where to look, and your mind is free to drift while the work continues in its steady rhythm. The fire crackles and the hammer rings and the steam hisses from the quenching bucket and the wind moans around the chimney, and these sounds blend together into a single quiet music that fills the cooperage and the hours of the winter day. The third hoop is the bilge hoop, and it is the largest of the iron bands because it must fit around the widest part of the barrel where the curve swells outward to its maximum diameter. You measure the circumference, and you cut the rivets, and you heat the iron, and you hammer it on the anvil, and you weld the joint, and you set it aside to cool. The bilge hoop is heavy, and it takes longer to heat because there is more iron to warm, and it takes longer to cool because there is more iron to hold the heat. You work with the same slow patience that you have applied to every other part of the barrel making, and you do not hurry, and you do not cut corners, because a barrel that fails at sea is a barrel that wastes the fish and the salt and the labor of the fishermen and the coopers and everyone else who touched it along the way. The fourth hoop is the second quarter hoop, and the fifth is the second chime hoop, and they are made in the same way as the first 3, and they are set aside to cool on the hearthstones until there is a row of 5 iron hoops arranged in order of size, from largest to smallest, waiting to be driven onto the barrel. The hoops are dark grey and black with a thin layer of fire scale from the heating, and they are still warm to the touch, and they smell of hot iron and of the quenching water and of the faint residue of the hearth fire that is baked into their surfaces. The driving of the iron hoops is the next step, and it is a step that requires care and a steady hand, because the iron is unforgiving, and it will crush the wood if it is driven too hard or at the wrong angle. You begin with a chime hoop at the top of the barrel, and you set it in place just above the crest groove, and you tap it gently with the hammer and the wooden driver working around the circle and moving the hoop down by small fractions of an inch. The sound of the hammer on the iron is a sharp clink that is different from the ringing note of the anvil. Work, and it is a sound that you have heard many thousands of times before. The hoop moves slowly down the taper of the staves, and it tightens as it goes, and the joints between the staves close further, and the barrel becomes more solid and more unified with each tap of the hammer. The quarter hoop goes on next, and it is driven down to its position about a third of the way from the top, and the bilge hoop is driven to the widest part of the curve, and the second quarter hoop and the second quarter hoop follow in their turn. The barrel is now bound with 5 iron hoops, and the wooden truss hoops are no longer needed, and you cut them away with the hatchet and you throw the pieces into the pile of kindling by the hearth. The barrel stands in the center of the room, and it is a true barrel now, with the shape and the strength and the weight of a thing that is finished, except for the heads and the sanding and the final small touches that will complete it. The iron hoops are not yet tight enough for the barrel to hold brine, because the wood will swell when it is wet, and the hoops will loosen slightly, and they must be driven tighter after the barrel has been soaked. But that is work for another day, and for now the hoops are on and the barrel is whole, and you can stand back and look at it and see the way the iron bands circle the pale spruce staves in a repeating pattern of dark and light that is pleasing to the eye in a simple geometric way. The rivets on the hoops are small dark circles that catch the lantern light, and the fire scale has been rubbed away in places by the driver and the hammer, and the bare iron shows through in bright silver patches that will rust again in the salt air. But that is the nature of iron, and it cannot be prevented. You sweep the floor around the barrel, and you gather the small pieces of cut rivet and the flakes of fire scale and the splinters of hazel from the truss hoops, and you add them to the kindling pile. The anvil goes back to its place on the fir block, and the hammers go back to their pegs on the wall, and the tongs and the chisel and the leather apron are put away in their proper places. The cooperage is tidy, and the barrel stands in the center of the room, and the fire in the hearth has burned down to a bed of coals that glow a steady orange red, and the lanterns cast their warm yellow circles of light, and the wind outside has shifted again, and it makes a different sound in the chimney, a lower sound that is more like a hum than a moan. You sit on the low stool, and you look at the barrel, and you think about the fish that will fill it in the summer. The fish are still swimming in the cold green water of the Grand Banks, and they do not know that a barrel has been made to hold them, and they do not know that a cooper in a frozen outport has spent the winter shaping spruce and hazel and iron into a vessel that will carry their salted flesh across the ocean. The fish know only the cold and the dark and the endless search for food, and they will continue in that way until the spring, when the water warms and they move inshore, and the fishermen set their lines, and the cycle begins again. The iron hoops will hold the barrel together through the long sea voyage, and through the heat of the southern ports, and through the years of use that may follow if the barrel is not broken up for firewood after its first journey. The iron will rust, and the wood will stain, and the barrel will become darker and heavier, and it will carry the marks of its travels in the dents and scratches and the faded paint of the merchant's mark. But tonight the barrel is new and clean, and it stands in the lantern light with its iron bands bright and its spruce staves pale and smooth, and it is a good barrel, and it will do its work well. You add a piece of wood to the fire, and you watch the flames rise up, and you listen to the wind, and you let the quiet of the winter evening settle over you like a blanket. The work of the day is done, and the barrel is one step closer to completion, and tomorrow you will make the heads and fit them into the crest grooves, and the day after that you will sand the outside smooth, and the winter will continue in this way until the ice breaks, and the first sail appears, and the world returns. But that is still far away, and there is no need to think about it now. There is only the barrel, and the fire, and the wind, and the long, slow silence of the night in the cooperage by the frozen sea. The salt store stands against the north wall of the cooperage, and it is not a separate building, but rather a room that was added onto the original structure some 30 years ago by a cooper whose name you do not know, and whose tools you now use, and whose bench you now work at. The door to the salt store is a low, narrow opening that was cut through the log wall and framed with rough planks of spruce, and it has no proper door hung on hinges, but only a heavy wool blanket that hangs from a wooden rod and that you must push aside to enter. The blanket is dark with age and stiff with the salt that has crystallized in its fibers over many seasons, and when you push it aside, it makes a soft rustling sound, like the sound of dry leaves stirring in a wind that is too light to feel on your skin. You have finished the first barrel of the winter, and it stands in the center of the cooperage, with its iron hoops tight, and its staves smooth, and its crest grooves cut clean and ready for the heads that you will make tomorrow or the day after. The barrel is empty, and it weighs perhaps 40 pounds as it sits there on the packed earth floor. And you can lift it by yourself without much effort, because you have lifted many barrels over many winters, and your arms and your back know the weight and the balance of a finished cask. You grasp the barrel by the chime hoop at the top and the bilge hoop at the middle, and you tilt it toward you, and you let it rest against your chest, and you walk it slowly across the floor toward the blanket door of the salt store. The movement of the barrel is a careful thing because the floor is uneven, and because the light from the lanterns does not reach all the way to the far corner where the salt store door is hidden in shadow. You walk with small, deliberate steps, and you feel the barrel shift slightly with each step, and you adjust your grip and your balance without thinking about it in the same way that you adjust the plane in your hands when the grain of the wood changes direction. The barrel is heavy, but the weight is a known weight, and it is not a burden, but simply a fact, like the cold of the iron, or the smell of the spruce, or the sound of the wind outside. You push the wool blanket aside with your shoulder, and you step through the low doorway into the salt store, and the first thing that you notice is the cold. The salt store has no hearth and no lantern and no source of warmth except what seeps through the log wall from the cooperage, and that warmth is barely enough to keep the temperature a few degrees above the freezing point of the outside air. The cold in the salt store is a dry cold that is different from the damp cold of the cooperage, and it has a clean, sharp quality that reminds you of the way the air feels on a clear winter night when the stars are out and the snow squeaks under your boots. The second thing that you notice is the smell, and the smell is the smell of salt and of fish under the long, slow passage of time. The salt store is a small room, perhaps 8 feet square, with a ceiling that is low enough that you must duck your head slightly when you stand near the walls. The walls are the same spruce logs as the cooperage, but they are covered with a white crust of salt that has built up over the years from the barrels that were stored here filled with brine and cod. The salt crust is not even, but rather it follows the contours of the logs and the chinking, and it forms small ridges and valleys and delicate crystalline formations that catch the faint light from the doorway and glint back at you like tiny stars frozen in the wood. The salt has worked its way into every crack and crevice, and it has become part of the fabric of the room in the same way that the smoke has become part of the rafters in the cooperage. You set the barrel down in the corner of the salt store where there is a clear space on the floor, and you position it carefully so that it stands upright and level and will not tip or roll if the building settles or if the frost heaves the ground outside. The floor of the salt store is the same packed earth as the cooperage, but it has been saturated with brine over many seasons, and the salt has crystallized in the soil, and it has made the surface hard and slightly slick with a faint white sheen that reflects the light in a soft glow. When you walk across this floor, your boots make a different sound than they make in the cooperage. A softer sound that is almost a whisper, because the salt crystals cushion your steps and absorb the noise. The barrel stands in the corner, and it looks small in the darkness of the salt store after seeming so large and solid in the warm light of the cooperage. The iron hoops are dark against the pale spruce, and they reflect a faint gleam from the doorway that is the only light in the room. And the wood of the stave seems to glow with a soft inner luminescence that is not really there, but is an effect of the contrast between the dark room and the brighter space beyond the blanket door. You stand for a moment and you look at the barrel, and you think about the fish that will fill it in the summer, and you think about the salt that will preserve the fish, and you think about the long journey across the ocean that the barrel will make when it is full and heavy and stacked in the dark hold of a ship. The salt that will fill this barrel along with the cod is not here yet, because the salt comes on the same ships that take the fish away, and it arrives in the spring when the fishing season begins. The salt is brought from Portugal and Spain, and from the islands of the Caribbean where the sun is hot and the seawater evaporates in shallow pans and leaves behind a white crust that is raked up and loaded into barrels and shipped north to the fishing grounds. The salt is coarse and grey, and it has a mineral smell that is different from the clean, sharp smell of the sea, and it will be packed in layers between the split cod until the barrel is full and the brine has risen to cover everything and the bung is driven tight and the barrel is ready for its journey. But that is all in the future, and the barrel is empty now. And it will remain empty for many months, while the winter continues and the ice thickens in the cove and the snow piles up against the walls of the cooperage. The emptiness of the barrel is not a sad thing because the barrel was made to be empty during the winter, and it is fulfilling its purpose by waiting just as the staves fulfilled their purpose, by waiting in the forest until the cooper came to cut them and shape them and turn them into a vessel. The waiting is part of the work, and it is a part that you have learned to accept over the years because there is no way to hurry the seasons and no way to make the fish arrive before the ice goes out, and no way to fill a barrel until the fish are caught and split and salted. The window in the salt store is a small square opening that was cut into the north wall when the room was added, and it is covered with the same oiled linen as the window in the cooperage. The linen is old and it has been stained by the salt air, and it has a yellowish cast that filters the grey daylight into a warm ambered glow, when the sun is high enough to reach this side of the building. But the sun is not high at this time of year, and the window shows only a flat grey square that is slightly lighter than the darkness of the room. The frost on the inside of the linen has grown thicker over the past weeks, and it has formed a pattern of feathery crystals that spread outward from the corners like the branches of a tiny frozen tree. The crystals catch the faint light from the doorway, and they sparkle with a cold white fire that is beautiful in a way that requires no thought or interpretation. You stand in the salt store for a long moment, and you breathe the cold dry air, and you smell the salt and the faint lingering scent of the fish that was stored here in summers past. The smell of the fish is not unpleasant, because it is a clean smell that has been preserved by the salt and the cold, and it does not have the rotten stench of fish that has spoiled in the heat. It is a smell that reminds you of the sea and of the fishing stages and of the long days of summer when the cod are running and the whole outport is alive with the sound of men shouting and boats creaking and gulls crying and the endless work of catching and splitting and salting and drying. That time will come again, but it is far away now, and the only sound in the salt store is the sound of your own breathing and the distant moan of the wind around the corner of the building. You turn away from the barrel and you walk back through the low doorway and you push the wool blanket aside and you step into the warmth and the light of the cooperage. The contrast is sharp, and it makes you aware of how cold the salt store really is and how warm the cooperage has become from the fire in the hearth and the heat of your body and the slow accumulation of warmth from the work of the day. You let the blanket fall back into place and you stand near the hearth for a moment, and you let the warmth soak into your hands and your face and the front of your wool shirt. The barrel is in the salt store now, and it will wait there through the rest of the winter and through the early spring until the first catch of cod is brought ashore and split and salted and packed into the waiting casks. You will make more barrels in the weeks ahead, and each one will join the first barrel in the salt store until there is a row of empty casks standing in the darkness waiting for their purpose to arrive. The making of the barrels is the work of the winter, and the weighting of the barrels is the work of the salt store, and the filling of the barrels is the work of the summer, and each part of the cycle depends on the parts that came before and will lead to the parts that come after. You walk to the bench and you pick up the leather thong that you use to measure the iron hoops, and you coil it carefully and you hang it on its peg near the door. The bench is clear now, and the tools are put away, and the floor is swept, and the fire is burning steadily in the hearth. The cooperage is quiet except for the familiar sounds of the wind and the fire and the settling of the logs in the walls. You sit on the low stool and you look at the empty space in the center of the room where the barrel stood just a short time ago, and you can still see the faint circular mark on the packed earth where the weight of the barrel pressed down and compacted the soil. The mark will fade over the next few days as you walk across it and as you sweep the floor and as the natural settling of the earth erases the evidence of the barrel's presence. But for now the mark is there, and it is a small reminder of the work that was done, and the barrel that was made, and the waiting that has begun. The salt store is silent behind its wool blanket door, and the barrel stands in the corner in the cold and the dark, and the frost continues to grow on the inside of the oiled linen window. The crystals of frost are forming slowly, and they are building on the crystals that formed yesterday and the day before, and they are creating a layered structure that is as complex and as ordered as the growth rings of the spruce staves. If you were to go back into the salt store with a lantern and hold it close to the window, you would see the individual crystals, and you would see the way they interlock and support each other, and you would see the tiny air pockets trapped between the layers of ice. But you do not go back into the salt store with a lantern because there is no need, and because the barrel does not need to be looked at, and because the frost does not need to be admired. The frost will continue to grow, and the barrel will continue to wait, and that is enough. The afternoon light outside has begun its slow fade toward evening, and the grey square of the cooperage window has deepened to a darker shade that tells you the sun is low behind the clouds and the short day is nearly done. You add a piece of wood to the fire and you watch the flames catch and rise, and you think about the heads that you will make tomorrow. The head staves are waiting on the bench where you left them, and they are straight and flat, and they have a different grain pattern than the side staves because they were cut from a different part of the tree. The head staves will be joined edge to edge with wooden dowels and then shaped into a circle that fits precisely into the crest groove and then sealed with a thin strip of woolcloth soaked in pine pitch to make the joint watertight. The making of the heads is a different kind of work than the raising of the barrel, and it requires a different kind of attention, and it will fill another day or two of the long winter. But that is tomorrow, and tomorrow and Norrow is not here yet. Tonight there is only the fire and the wind, and the quiet of the cooperage, and the darker quiet of the salt store behind the wool blanket door. The barrel stands in the corner of the salt store, and it is empty, and it is waiting, and the frost is growing on the window, and the salt crystals are gleaming faintly on the walls, and the smell of the sea and the fish and the long summer's past is hanging in the cold still air. The waiting is a quiet thing, and it makes no sound, and it requires no attention, and it will continue through the night and through the night's day and through all the days, until the ice breaks and the first sail appears and the world returns to this frozen outport by the sea. You bank the fire for the night, and you blow out one of the lanterns, and you leave the other burning low on its hook. The light from the single lantern reaches across the room, and it touches the wool blanket that covers the door to the salt store, and it makes the blanket glow with a faint warm brown that is almost the color of the spruce staves. Behind the blanket the barrel waits in the dark, and the frost grows on the window, and the salt crystals hold their shape, and they gleam, and the long winter night settles over the cooperage, and the salt store, and the frozen cove, and the white hills, and the whole silent world of the outport in the deep of winter in the year of 1684. The heart of winter has arrived in the outport, and it has brought with it a darkness that is different from the darkness of November or December. The darkness of January and February is a dense, heavy thing that presses against the walls of the cooperage and fills every corner and every crevice with a blackness that seems almost solid. You wake in the morning and you light the lantern and you look out the window and you see nothing but the reflection of your own face and the small yellow flame floating in the glass. The sun has not yet risen, and it will not rise for several more hours, and when it does rise it will climb only a short distance above the southern horizon, and it will cast a pale twilight that lasts for perhaps 4 hours before it sinks again and the darkness returns. The rationing of light becomes a central concern of each day, because light is the thing that allows you to work, and work is the thing that fills the hours and keeps the mind from turning inward too far. You have a limited supply of oil for the lanterns, and you must make it last until the spring, when the first ship arrives with fresh supplies from the south. The oil is rendered from the livers of the cod that were caught in the summer, and it has a pale golden color and a faint fishy smell that you no longer notice because it has been part of your life for so long. The oil burns cleanly if the wick is trimmed properly, and it produces a steady yellow flame that is bright enough to work by but not so bright that it wastes the precious fuel. You have learned over the years to arrange your work so that the tasks requiring the most light are done during the brief hours of daylight, and the tasks that can be done by feel or by the dim glow of the fire are saved for the long evenings. The sanding of the barrel is a task that can be done in low light because your hands know the shape of the wood and your fingers can feel the rough spots and the smooth spots and the places where a little more work is needed. You sit on the low stool near the hearth with the barrel between your knees, and you hold a piece of dried dogfish skin in your hand, and you rub it slowly back and forth across the surface of the spruce staves. The dogfish skin is a traditional material for sanding in this part of the world because it is rough enough to smooth the wood, but not so rough that it leaves deep scratches that would need to be removed with finer abrasives. The skin comes from a small shark that is caught in the nets during the summer fishing, and the fishermen save the skins and dry them on the flakes alongside the cod until they are stiff and hard and covered with tiny tooth-like scales that point in one direction. When you rub the skin against the wood in the direction of the scales, it cuts very fine shavings from the surface, and it leaves behind a smooth, velvety texture that is pleasant to touch. When you rub against the direction of the scales, it catches and drags, and it can tear the fibers of the wood, and so you learn quickly to work with the grain and with the lie of the tiny teeth. The sound of the sanding is a soft whisper that is almost too quiet to hear over the crackle of the fire and the moan of the wind. It is a sound like the sound of a hand brushing against a wool coat, or the sound of dry leaves sliding across each other in a light breeze. The sound does not change much from 1 minute to the next, and it becomes a kind of background hum that fills the cooperage and lulls the mind into a state of quiet attention that is not quite thinking and not quite sleeping, but something in between. The barrel that you are sanding is the third barrel of the winter, and it has been raised and trussed and hooped with iron and fitted with heads, and it stands complete except for this final smoothing of the outside surface. The staves are pale spruce, with a faint pinkish tint from the resin, and the grain runs in long straight lines from the chime to the bilge and back again. The iron hoops are dark with a thin bloom of rust that has already begun to form in the salt air, and they contrast sharply with the pale wood. The barrel is a good barrel, and it will hold its brine and its fish, and it will make the journey across the ocean without leaking or failing. And that is all that a barrel needs to do. You turn the barrel slowly with your knees, and you work your way around the circumference, sanding each stave in turn, and paying particular attention to the areas around the hoops where the wood has been compressed by the iron and where small ridges have formed that need to be smoothed away. The dogfish skin wears down gradually, and you replace it with a fresh piece when it becomes too smooth to cut effectively. The worn pieces are not wasted because they can still be used for the final polishing when the wood is already smooth and only needs a light touch to bring out the luster of the grain. The light from the window has faded from grey to deep blue and then to black, while you have been working, and you have not noticed the change because your attention has been on the barrel and on the feel of the wood under your hands. You look up and you see that the square of oiled linen is dark, and you realize that the brief daylight has ended and that you have been working by the light of the fire in the single lantern for some time without being aware of the transition. This is the way of the deep winter, when the days are so short that they seem to pass in a blink, and the long nights stretch out before you like a calm sea with no shore in sight. You light the second lantern because the work of sanding requires a certain amount of light to see the surface of the wood and to judge whether the texture is even and smooth. The second lantern adds its yellow flame to the first, and the two together create a pool of warm light around the hearth and the stool and the barrel. Beyond that pool, the cooperage falls away into deep shadow, and the walls and the rafters and the stacks of staves are invisible except as dark shapes that shift and move when the lantern flames flicker in the draughts from the chimney. The management of the lanterns is a small ritual that you perform several times each day. You check the level of the oil in the reservoir, and you trim the wick with the small shears, and you clean the glass pane with a scrap of soft cloth to remove the soot that accumulates from the flame. The trimming of the wick is important because a wick that is too long will smoke, and the smoke will darken the glass and reduce the light and waste the oil. A wick that is too short will not draw enough oil, and the flame will be small and weak, and it may gutter and go out. The correct length is a thing that you know by feel and by the look of the flame, and you adjust it without thinking, in the same way that you adjust the plane in your hands or the pressure of the dogfish skin against the wood. The oil in the lantern reservoirs is getting low, and you calculate in your mind how many days remain before the supply will be exhausted. The calculation is not precise, because you do not know exactly when the first ship will arrive in the spring, and you do not know how many hours of lantern light you will need between now and then. You know only that you must be careful, and that you must not waste a single drop of the precious golden liquid that keeps the darkness at bay. You have learned to do many things in the near dark over the years, and you will do them again if the oil runs out before the ship arrives. You can sharpen the tools by feel, and you can sand the barrels by the light of the fire alone, and you can sit in the darkness and listen to the wind and wait for the morning. The sanding of the barrel continues for another hour by the light of the two lanterns, and the fire and the surface of the wood grows smoother and more lustrous with each pass of the dogfish skin. The pale spruce takes on a soft glow that reflects the lantern light in a warm golden sheen, and the grain becomes more visible as the rough surface fibers are worn away and the harder winter rings stand out in slight relief against the softer summer wood. The barrel is becoming beautiful in a quiet, understated way that is the beauty of well-made things that are made to be useful and that find their beauty in their usefulness rather than in any decoration or ornament. You run your bare hand over the surface of the barrel, and you feel the smoothness and the faint warmth that the wood has absorbed from the fire and from your own body heat. The texture is like the texture of old flannel that has been washed many times and has lost its roughness, but kept its softness. The grain of the spruce creates a subtle pattern of ridges that your fingertips can detect, even though your eyes can barely see them in the dim light. The iron hoops are cool and smooth under your touch, and they divide the barrel into sections like the lines on a map dividing the land into territories. The fire in the hearth has burned down, and you add a piece of wood, and you watch the flames catch and rise, and you listen to the soft crackle and hiss of the burning resin. The wood is dry spruce from the pile outside, and it burns hot and fast, and it sends a shower of sparks up the chimney when a pocket of resin ignites. The sparks are tiny points of orange light that swirl and dance in the draught and then fade into the darkness above. You watch them for a moment, and then you return your attention to the barrel and to the slow, steady motion of the sanding. The wind outside has risen during the evening, and it presses against the walls of the cooperage in long, slow surges that make the timbers creak and the lanterns sway on their chains. The sound of the wind is a low, constant hum that rises and falls in pitch as the gusts strengthen and weaken, and it blends with the sound of the fire, and the sound of the sanding, and the sound of your own breathing. These sounds are the only sounds in the world, and they have been the only sounds for so many weeks that you can no longer imagine any other sounds. The cry of a gull, or the splash of a wave, or the voice of another person speaking would seem strange and jarring and out of place in this world of wind and fire and wood. The deep winter is a time of waiting, and the waiting is a thing that you have learned to accept without resentment or impatience. The barrels wait in the salt store for the fish that will fill them, and the fish wait in the cold green water of the banks for the spring warming that will bring them inshore, and the fishermen wait in their houses in Fairyland and St. Knot John's for the ice to break and the season to begin, and the whole world seems to be waiting for something that is still far away and that cannot be hurried. You are part of this waiting, and your work is part of it, and the slow sanding of the barrel is part of it, and the careful rationing of the lantern oil is part of it. The second lantern begins to flicker, and you realize that the oil is low and that you have been working for longer than you intended. You set the dogfish skin aside, and you blow out the second lantern, and you sit for a moment in the reduced light of the single flame and the fire. The cooperage seems smaller in the dimmer light, and the shadows have crept closer to the hearth, and the barrel is a dark shape between your knees, with only the faintest gleam of reflected firelight on its smooth surface. The wind moans and the fire crackles, and the ice in the cove makes its thin, high, ringing sound. And these are the sounds of the winter night, and they will continue until the morning. You bank the fire carefully, and you cover the coals with a thick layer of ash, and you blow out the last lantern, and you sit in the complete darkness for a long moment, letting your eyes adjust, and letting the sounds of the night fill your ears. The darkness is not frightening, because it is a familiar darkness that you have known for many winters, and it holds no surprises or threats. It is simply the absence of light, and it will pass when the morning comes, and the grey twilight returns, and the brief day begins again. You rise from the stool, and you walk slowly across the dark cooperage to the cot in the corner, and you lie down, and you pull the wool blanket up to your chin, and you listen to the wind and the fire and the ice. The barrel stands in the centre of the room where you left it, and it is smooth and almost finished, and it will wait there through the night and through the next day until you return to it and complete the final polishing. The ration of light for today has been spent, and it was spent well, and there will be more light tomorrow if the oil holds out, and if the ship arrives before the supply is gone. But that is a thought for another day, and for now there is only the darkness and the warmth of the blanket and the slow, steady rhythm of your breathing as you drift towards sleep in the deep heart of the winter in the cooperage by the frozen sea. The sound that wakes you on the first morning of the change is a sound that you have not heard for many months, and it takes you a moment to recognize it, because your ears have grown accustomed to the dry silence of the deep winter. The sound is a soft, steady dripping coming from somewhere outside the cooperage, and it is the sound of water falling from the edge of the roof, where the snow has begun to melt in the faint warmth of a sun that is climbing higher each day. You lie on the cot, and you listen to the dripping, and you feel a small shift inside yourself that is not excitement, but rather a quiet acknowledgement that the long season of darkness and cold is beginning to loosen its grip on the outport. You rise and you walk to the door, and you open it just wide enough to look out at the cove and the hills beyond. The air that comes in is still cold, but it has a different quality than the air of January and February. A dampness that carries the smell of wet earth and of the sea and of something green that is still hidden under the snow, but is beginning to stir in the roots of the spruce trees on the hillside. The icicles that hang from the eaves of the cooperage are dripping steadily, and each drop catches the pale morning light and flashes once before it falls to the snow below, where it drills a small round hole in the crust. The holes are arranged in a line along the drip edge, and they are growing deeper by the hour, and by tomorrow there will be a channel of meltwater running from the base of the wall down toward the frozen cove. The ice in the cove is still solid, and it stretches from the shore out to the narrow entrance where the tide moves beneath the surface and keeps a small channel open. But the color of the ice has changed from the flat gray of midwinter to a softer blue-gray that tells you the crystals are beginning to weaken and the bonds between them are starting to loosen. The change is not visible to the eye in any single moment, but it is visible in the accumulation of days, and you can see it now because you have watched this ice for many winters and you know the signs of its decline. The ice groans occasionally with a deep subsonic vibration that you feel in your feet more than you hear with your ears, and the groaning is the sound of the tide pushing against the underside of the frozen sheet and flexing it in slow, rhythmic pulses. You close the door and you return to the hearth, and you stir the ashes and you find the coals that have survived the night, and you build the fire back to a steady blaze. The warmth spreads outward into the room, and it meets the damp air from outside, and it creates a faint mist near the door where the two temperatures collide. The mist hangs in the air for a moment, and then it fades and you sit on the low stool, and you look around the cooperage at the work that has been done over the long winter months. The barrels stand in a row in the salt store, and they are finished and smooth, and they are waiting for the fish that will come with the spring. There are 7 barrels altogether, and each one is a good barrel made from spruce staves and iron hoops, and the slow patient labor of your hands. The heads are fitted, and the crest grooves are tight, and the bungs are carved and ready to be driven home once the barrels are filled with salted cod and brine. The barrels are empty now, but they will not be empty for much longer, because the world outside is beginning to wake from its long sleep. The work of the cooperage in these last weeks of winter is not the work of making new barrels, but rather the work of preparing for the season to come. You take down the tools from their pegs one by one, and you clean them and oil them and check them for any damage that might have occurred during the months of use. The jointer plane needs a new wedge because the old one has become compressed, and it no longer holds the iron as firmly as it should. You select a small piece of dry beech from the scrap pile, and you shape it with the draw knife and the chisel until it fits perfectly in the angled slot. And you tap it home with the mallet and you test the iron, and it is solid and ready for another season. The draw knife needs sharpening, and you spend an hour at the stone working the curved blade with slow, careful passes until the edge gleams in the lantern light, and you can shave a thin curl of hair from your forearm with a single light stroke. The crows needs oiling, and you rub a few drops of cod liver oil into the wooden guide and into the joint where the saw blade attaches to the frame. The hammers and the mallets are sound, and they need nothing except to be wiped clean of the sweat and the dust that have accumulated on their handles. The anvil is lifted from its fir block, and the block is turned over to expose a fresh surface because the old surface has become dented and charred from many months of hot iron and hammer blows. The fresh wood is pale and clean, and it smells of fir resin when you set the anvil back in place and tap it down with the mallet. The quenching bucket is emptied of its rusty water and scrubbed with a handful of sand from the beach until the inside is clean, and then it is refilled with fresh water from the barrel near the door. The floor of the cooperage is swept carefully, and the shavings that have accumulated over the winter are gathered into a large pile near the hearth. The shavings are dry and fragrant, and they will be used for kindling in the spring kitchen and for spreading on the garden soil, to keep the weeds down and to hold the moisture in the ground. Nothing is wasted and everything has a purpose, and the sweeping of the floor is a ritual that marks the end of the winter work and the beginning of the preparations for the new season. The light through the window has changed in ways that are subtle but unmistakable. The grey of the deep winter has given way to a paler, brighter grey that sometimes breaks open to reveal a patch of pale blue sky and the glimpse of the sun that is climbing higher each day. The sun reaches further into the cooperage now, and he casts a warm rectangle of light on the packed earth floor that moves slowly across the room as the hours pass. You find yourself standing in that rectangle of light more often than you used to, and you feel the warmth of it on your face and on your hands, and it is a different kind of warmth than the warmth of the fire, a warmth that carries the promise of the summer that is coming. The sound of the dripping from the eaves has become a constant companion now, and it is joined by other sounds that you have not heard for many months. The chickadees have returned to the spruce trees behind the cooperage, and they call to each other with their small, clear voices that sound like the creak of a tiny hinge. The snow buntings are still here, and they flutter across the white surface of the cove in small flocks that rise and fall like smoke blown by the wind. The gulls have not yet returned, but they will come soon, and their harsh cries will fill the air above the harbor and announce that the fish are moving inshore and the season has truly begun. You walk out onto the shore one afternoon when the sun is high and the air is almost warm, and you stand at the edge of the ice and you look out toward the open water that is visible now as a dark line on the horizon. The ice is rotten and it crunches under your boots in a way that is different from the hard crunch of the midwinter ice, and you know that it will break up within a few weeks and the cove will be open again and the boats will come. You can see the channel where the tide moves, and it is wider now than it was a month ago, and the water in the channel is dark and cold, and it moves with the slow, deliberate power that is the power of the sea itself. The barrels in the salt store are ready, and they have been ready for some time. You go into the salt store on the last day of the winter work, and you stand in the cold, dim room, and you look at the row of 7 barrels standing against the wall. The frost on the window has melted, and the oiled linen shows a square of pale grey sky with a single branch of a spruce tree visible in one corner. The salt crust on the walls glistens with a faint dampness from the increased humidity of the spring air, and the smell of the room is the smell of salt and old wood and the faint, clean scent of the sea that is waking up outside. You run your hand over the smooth surface of the nearest barrel, and you feel the grain of the spruce and the cool iron of the hoops, and you think about the fish that will soon fill this cask. The fish are swimming somewhere out beyond the horizon, and they do not know that they are swimming toward this outport and toward these barrels and toward the salt that will preserve their flesh for the long journey across the ocean. The fish know only the cold green water and the endless search for food and the ancient instinct that drives them inshore when the water warms and the capelin run and the summer begins. The waiting is almost over and the work of the winter is complete. You have made 7 good barrels, and they will hold 7 barrels of salted cod. And those 7 barrels will travel across the sea to Portugal or Spain or the islands of the Caribbean, and they will be opened in warm ports where the sun is hot and the people speak languages that you have never heard. The fish will be eaten, and the barrels will be broken up or used for other purposes, and the wood that grew on the hillside above the outport will end its life far from the place where it began. This is the way of things, and it has always been this way, and it will continue to be this way long after you are gone, and long after the cooperage has fallen into ruin, and the outport has been abandoned to the spruce trees and the gulls. You close the blanket door of the salt store, and you walk back into the cooperage, and you stand in the rectangle of sunlight that falls through the window, and you feel the warmth on your face. The tools are clean and oiled and hanging on their pegs, and the floor is swept, and the fire in the hearth has burned down to a bed of coals that glow a steady orange red. The cooperage is quiet, except for the drip of the melting snow outside, and the distant cry of a chickadee, and the low groan of the ice in the cove as it shifts with the rising tide. The first sail of the season will appear on the horizon in a few weeks, or perhaps a month, depending on the wind and the ice and the whims of the sea. The sail will be small at first, just a pale speck against the grey water, and then it will grow larger, and you will see the hull and the masts and the men on the deck, and you will know that the isolation of the winter has ended. The ship will bring salt and supplies and news from the outside world, and it will take the barrels of salted fish away when it leaves in the autumn. The cycle will continue, and the outport will live through another year, and the cooperage will fill again with the sound of the plane, and the hammer and the slow patient work of making barrels for the fish that swim in the cold sea. You sit on the low stool near the hearth, and you pick up a piece of the dogfish skin, and you run it absently over a small section of a scrap stave that is lying on the bench. The motion is familiar, and it requires no thought, and your hands do it, while your mind drifts across the cove and the hills and the wide grey ocean that stretches away to the east. The sound of the sanding is a soft whisper, and the sound of the dripping is a soft patter, and the sound of the fire is a soft crackle, and these sounds blend together into a single quiet music that is the music of the end of winter in the cooperage by the sea. The days will grow longer now, and the sun will climb higher, and the snow will melt away until only the patches in the deep shade of the spruce trees remain. The ground will thaw, and the first green shoots will push up through the matted grass of the previous summer, and the gulls will return, and the boats will come, and the work of the fishing season will begin. You will split cod and salt cod and pack cod into the barrels that you made during the long dark months, and the barrels will be loaded onto the ships, and they will sail away, and the outport will grow quiet again in the autumn, when the last boat leaves for the south. But that is all in the future, and the future is not something that you think about in any detailed way. The present is enough. And the present is this quiet afternoon, with the sun slanting through the window, and the drip of the melting snow, and the smell of the spruce, and the salt in the sea. The winter work is done, and the spring work has not yet begun, and there is a small space of time between the two, when there is nothing that must be done, and nowhere that must be gone, and no one that must be gone, and no one that must be spoken to. You sit in that space, and you let it hold you. And you listen to the sounds of the world waking up outside, and you feel the slow turning of the seasons, like the slow turning of a great wheel that has been turning since before you were born, and will continue turning long after you are gone. The barrel stave under your hands grows smoother and smoother with each pass of the dogfish skin, and eventually it is as smooth as it can be, and you set it aside on the bench. The rectangle of sunlight has moved across the floor, and it now touches the edge of the hearth, and the firelight and the sunlight blend together in a warm golden glow that fills the corner of the room. You add a small piece of wood to the fire, not because the room is cold, but because the fire is a companion and you have grown used to its presence over the long winter months. The sound of the dripping outside continues, and it will continue through the night and through the next day and through all the days, until the snow is gone and the ground is bare, and the first flowers appear in the sheltered spots along the south-facing slope. The ice in the cove groans again, and the sound is deeper and longer than before, and it is the sound of the sea reminding the land that it will not be held back forever. The tide is turning, and the season is changing, and the long winter isolation of 1684 is coming to an end in the outport by the frozen sea. You sit on the stool, and you watch the fire, and you listen to the sounds of the spring that is coming, and you feel a quiet peace that is the peace of work completed, and of cycles turning, and of a life lived in rhythm with the seasons and the sea. The cooperage is warm, and the tools are ready, and the barrels are waiting, and the fish are swimming somewhere out beyond the horizon. Everything is as it should be, and everything will continue as it has always continued. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.